The wind in late 1880s Wyoming carried more dust than rain. It scoured the plains, tearing at the sagebrush and whistling through the cracked, dry earth of Cotton Creek. The town lived on cattle, or rather, the memory of cattle. The drought had thinned the herds, just as the played-out silver mine had thinned the population. The railroad branch line was 2 hard days' ride south, and it felt further every day. Summer baked the land, and winter froze what was left. Eliza May Carter walked toward the town, the dust settling on the shoulders of her worn black dress. She was 25, but the last year had etched lines of worry around her eyes that belonged to a woman twice her age. She was the widow of a gold prospector, a man who had found nothing but a fever in the hills and left her with calloused hands and a doctor's bill that felt heavier than a gravestone. She knew how to work. She could birth a calf, trim a hoof, and stitch saddle leather tighter than any man, but her skills were not wanted in a town that was shrinking. Her short-term goal was simple: survive. Pay the debt on her husband's burial plot before the town council gave it to someone else. Her deeper goal, the one she barely let herself whisper in the dark, was to find a place to be respected, a place to call home. She walked past the saloon, where the loafers watched her with idle eyes, and past the sturdy wooden church. She headed for the general store, the social hub of Cotton Creek. Inside, the air smelled of coffee beans, cured tobacco, and floor wax. Mrs. Abernathy, the boarding house landlady, was holding court by the pickle barrel. Her voice was loud and carried judgment easily. Mrs. Abernathy saw Eliza enter and her voice dropped, but her eyes did not. Eliza felt the familiar chill. In a town this small, a poor widow was not a tragedy. She was a burden, or worse, a temptation, bad luck for the women, and a potential snare for the men. Eliza ignored the whispers and approached the counter. She had 1 coin left. She asked the proprietor, Mr. Hanson, if he had any day work, mending, cleaning, anything. Mr. Hanson looked uncomfortable. He glanced at Mrs. Abernathy, who was watching Eliza with sharp, bird-like intensity. Before he could answer, a man in a dusty rancher's coat spoke from the back of the store, near the feed sacks. He said Jonah Hale was looking for help. Mrs. Abernathy sniffed. She said Hale needed more than help. He needed a miracle, what with his sister gone and those 2 children running wild. The man corrected her. He said it was just barn work. Eliza turned. Barn work was work. She asked where she could find Mr. Hale. The man gestured west, toward the foothills, the Hale Ranch, the one with the broken windmill. Eliza spent her last coin on a small piece of hardtack and left the store. The whispers resumed before the door had swung shut. The walk to the Hale Ranch took an hour. The place was tidy, but quiet, too quiet for a cattle ranch. The fences were mended, but the paint on the main house was peeling. And just as the man said, the big windmill stood frozen, its blades stuck fast against the pale sky. It looked like a heart that had stopped beating. A man was in the corral, working with a young horse on a long line. He moved with a quiet economy, no wasted motion. This was Jonah Hale. He was 32, a former cavalryman who had seen fighting. He was lean and sparing with his words. He had a deep scar along his jaw that disappeared into his collar. He looked, Eliza thought, like a man holding a door closed against a powerful storm. He had buried his sister 3 weeks ago. A carriage accident on the pass. She had been coming to help him, bringing her twin children, Nate and Nora. They were 4 years old. Now they were his. Jonah Hale, who was comfortable with the silence of the plains and the company of horses, was now a father to 2 small, grieving children. He was terrified of losing anyone else. Eliza stood by the fence, waiting to be noticed. She did not call out. Jonah finished with the horse, gave it a pat, and turned. His eyes were gray and assessing. He saw her worn dress, the black mourning ribbon tied around one wrist, and the competence in her hands. Eliza told him her name, Eliza May Carter. She said she heard he needed help. Jonah's gaze was direct. He told her the talk in town was likely wrong. He did not need a housekeeper. He did not need a nanny. Eliza kept her chin up. She said she heard he needed barn work. Jonah paused. He looked at her hands, saw the calluses. He looked at the barn. It was a mess. Since his foreman, Wade Kincaid, had been fired for mistreating the other hands, things had piled up. Wade was a bad sort, greedy and mean, and was rumored to be running with rustlers now that the drought made cattle so valuable. Jonah needed help, but he was wary. He had his reasons. The town, the children. He told her the work was the barn, mucking out the stalls, cleaning the tack, sleeping in the tack shed. He would pay by the day. She would not be coming into the main house. The line was clear. Eliza nodded. The shed was better than the street. Day wages were better than nothing. She said she could start now. Jonah gestured to the barn. He told her the shovels were inside. He said he had to ride the fence line, checking for rustlers. Banker Lyle was tightening his grip on every ranch in the valley, and any lost steer was another nail in the coffin. He rode out without another word, leaving her alone with the silent house and the neglected barn. Eliza set to work. The barn smelled sour. She opened the big doors to let the wind blow through. She was methodical. She mucked the stalls, laying down fresh, clean straw. She found a lame mare and gently checked her hoof, a loose shoe. She noted it. She found the feed store, saw weevils in the oats. She made a note to sift it. She found broken harnesses and worn bridles, and with an expert hand, she began to clean and oil the leather, her stitches small and tight. She worked all afternoon, the physical labor a familiar comfort. The barn slowly transformed from a place of neglect to a place of order. By the time the sun began to paint the sky in shades of bruised orange and purple, she was exhausted, but the barn was clean. She made herself a small bed of clean hay in the tack shed, as promised. She ate the hardtack, washing it down with water from the pump. The main house remained dark. Not a single lamp was lit. It was a house of grief. She settled into the hay, the smell of leather and straw around her. The black ribbon on her wrist felt tight. She was thinking of her husband's debt when she heard a sound, a small cough. Eliza sat up. Two small figures stood in the massive barn doorway. Silhouetted against the fading light, a boy and a girl, Nate and Nora. They were identical in size, with shocks of dark hair, and they were watching her with wide, silent eyes. They wore only their thin nightshirts. Eliza's first instinct was to call for their father, but Jonah was gone. Her next was to lead them back to the cold, dark house, but they did not move. They just stared. She held out a hand. She kept her voice low and soft. She said it was cold, and they should be in bed. The little boy, Nate, stepped forward. He pointed to the clean straw. The little girl, Nora, clutched the front of her nightshirt. Eliza understood. The house was empty. The house was where their mother, their aunt, was gone from. The barn was warm. It smelled of animals and hay. It smelled alive. She moved aside, making room on the hay bale. She told them they could sit for a minute, but just a minute. They crept in, sitting stiffly beside her. Nora was shivering, less from the cold and more from a tremor that seemed to live inside her. Eliza watched her for a moment, then reached for a handful of the clean straw she had piled in the corner. Her fingers, rough and calloused, moved with surprising delicacy. She twisted the straw, bending and folding it, tying it with a bit of twine from her pocket. In a minute, she had fashioned a small, simple doll. She held it out to Nora. The little girl looked at it, her eyes tracking the simple shape. Eliza whispered, her voice rough from the dust. "The dolls are not afraid of the dark," she asked the little girl. "Are you?" Nora stared at the straw doll. She looked at Eliza, then back at the doll. She gave a single, slow nod. Then, in a movement so quick it startled Eliza, the little girl moved forward and buried her face in Eliza's neck. her small arms wrapping tight. The boy, Nate, watched for another second before he curled up against Eliza's other side, his head resting on her lap. Eliza sat frozen, a 4-year-old child clinging to each side. She smelled the soap on their hair. She felt their small bodies, heavy with exhaustion. She did not know what to do, so she did nothing. She just sat, her own weariness pressing down. And she began to hum a low, simple tune, a tune her own mother had hummed. An hour later, Jonah Hale rode back in. He was tired, cold, and worried about his fences. He unsaddled his horse, his mind on Banker Lyle and Wade Kincaid. He led the horse into the barn, his eyes adjusting to the dark. He stopped. In the clean stall, illuminated by a shaft of moonlight, were 3 shapes. Eliza May Carter was leaning against a hay bale, fast asleep and curled in her arms. Tucked securely against her were his children, Nate and Nora. The image hit Jonah like a physical blow. His breath caught in his chest. The house had been so silent. The children had not slept through the night since the accident. He had tried. He had sat in the dark by their beds, his large, scarred hands useless. He had not heard a lullaby, had not felt the simple weight of a sleeping child, since his sister had been alive to provide it. And here, in his barn, a stranger he had hired only to muck stalls, a poor widow with nothing to her name, had done what he could not. Jonah Hale stood in the shadows of the doorway, his heart aching with a sensation that was not just grief. He gripped the brim of his hat, his knuckles white. He did not move. He just watched the steady rise and fall of their breathing. And for the first time in months, something other than loss flickered in the cold house of his heart. It was small, and it frightened him, but it was there. It was hope. The dawn broke cold and sharp. Jonah Hale had not slept. He had spent the night in his kitchen chair, watching the barn. He saw Eliza emerge in the gray light, her movements stiff from the hay. She woke the children gently, without panic. He watched her lead them by the hand to the porch of the main house. She pointed them inside toward the kitchen, then turned and walked back to the barn. She picked up the pitchfork and went back to work as if mucking stalls was the only thing in the world. Jonah waited until the sun was fully up. He walked to the barn, his long shadow falling over the clean straw. Eliza stopped her work, her hands tightening on the wooden handle. She did not speak. She just waited. He cleared his throat. The words felt heavy in his mouth. He told her he would keep her on for another week. The barn work, he said, and he needed someone to keep an eye on the twins. At night. He rushed to add the conditions, his voice firming up. She would remain in the tack shed. She was not to enter the main house. He said it was important. He had to think of appearances. The town. He spoke of boundaries, a line drawn in the dust between the house and the barn, a line she was not to cross. Eliza felt the sting of it. A cleaner of manure, a night watchman for children. She was good enough to comfort them in the dark, but not fit to cross his threshold in the light. Her pride, the only thing she owned, free and clear, felt scraped raw. But then she thought of the doctor's bill. She thought of the small wooden cross marking her husband's grave, a patch of earth that was not yet paid for. If she left, that debt would remain. The money, even this, was a shield. She agreed. Her voice was level. She would stay, but her eyes were clear and direct. She would not beg, she would not borrow. She would keep her head high while she shoveled the refuse. A strange thing happened. The line Jonah had drawn was immediately crossed, not by the adults, but by the children. That night, Jonah put Nate and Nora to bed in their small room. He sat with them, his large presence a silent, awkward comfort, until their breathing deepened. He went to his own room, the weight of the day pressing him down. Hours later, a bad dream woke him, a memory of cannon fire and shouting. The house was silent, too silent. He rose and walked to the children's room. The beds were empty. His heart seized. He grabbed his pistol from the holster, his first thought of rustlers, of coyotes, of every danger the prairie held. He ran outside, bootless, into the cold night air. He ran to the barn. He found them in the tack shed, curled against Eliza on the clean hay. She was not asleep. She was wrapped in her thin blanket, pointing up through the small, open shed window at the swath of stars. He heard her low voice, rough but steady. She was telling them about the North Star. She said it was a guide. It showed you where you were and how to get home. She told them it never moved, and you could always count on it. Nora asked in a small voice if their mother was up there. Eliza was quiet for a moment. Then she said she believed their mother was part of all that light, watching over them. Jonah stood in the shadows, his gun hanging uselessly at his side. He watched his children, relaxed and safe, listening. The next morning, and the morning after that, their bedding was dry. The small, shameful secret of their nightly grief had eased. Jonah Hale, the ex-cavalryman, the rancher, had to admit this poor widow could do something he could not. She could quiet the storm in his children. Jonah had hired a new foreman just before Eliza arrived, a man named Jesse Pike. Jesse showed up to start work, a solid, easygoing man with dark skin and kind eyes. He was a seasoned cowboy, and he looked at the Hale ranch with a practical gaze. He noticed the clean barn, the mended tack, and the woman in the worn black dress trimming a horse's hoof with a steady, practiced hand. He tipped his hat to Eliza. She nodded back. Jesse was not a man for gossip. He was a man for work. He saw her lift a feed sack that would make other men grunt. He developed a quick respect for her. Jesse Pike was a man of conscience, a good counterweight to the memory of Wade Kincaid, whose cruelty still seemed to soak into the ground. But the town of Cotton Creek was not as kind as Jesse. When Jonah rode in for supplies, the social pressure began. Mrs. Abernathy, the boarding house owner, stopped him outside the general store. She said it was a terrible shame, him being all alone with those two angels. But, she said, tongues were wagging. A widow, in his barn, so close to those impressionable children. It was not proper. Reverend Pierce was next. He spoke to Jonah after the brief Sunday service Jonah attended out of duty. The Reverend spoke of propriety and the moral standing of the community. He said Jonah should seek a nanny with a good name, a woman of standing from the church. He said letting a vagrant woman, a widow of no means, run wild in the barn was a poor example for the children. The words were a whip. They struck at Eliza, but they hit Jonah too. He was a private man, and he hated the town peering into his life, into his grief. He left the church with a stiff back and said nothing, his silence a wall. Eliza ignored the town. She focused on the ranch. She was a quick learner. She watched Jesse mix the special feed for the weaning calves, noting the proportions of molasses and grain. The next day, she did it herself. She learned to identify the faint, sour scent of damp hay that meant rot. She deodorized the stalls with lime wash until the barn smelled clean and dry. She proved her value not with words, but with sweat and competence. Jonah watched her. He had stopped thinking of her as just a barn hand. He saw her expertise. His voice, when he spoke to her, lost its sharp edge of command. He no longer gave her orders. He asked her questions. He asked her opinion on the lame mare. He asked her if she thought the stored oats would last. One afternoon, the sky turned a sick, yellowish brown. A sandstorm blew in from the high desert. The wind howled, carrying fine grit that stung the skin and blinded the eyes. Jonah and Eliza were caught in the main corral, trying to get the spooked horses settled. The wind tore a loose shutter from the barn and sent it spinning. Jonah turned, blinded by the sudden cloud of dust. Eliza grabbed his arm. Her grip was strong, unyielding. She pulled him hard, dragging him toward the small overhang of the stable roof. They huddled there, the world disappearing in a roaring cloud of red dust. They were pressed close. Jonah was coughing, the grit thick in his lungs. Eliza, practical as ever, began to bat the thickest layer of sand from the shoulders of his coat. It was an impersonal gesture, like dusting furniture or beating a rug. But it was not. Her hand was firm. He could feel the warmth of it through his shirt. He managed to speak, his voice rough and choked. He said, "Thank you, Mistress Carter." She paused her dusting. She looked up at him, her eyes squinting against the wind. A small, dry smile touched her chapped lips. She said it was the first time anyone had used that title for her, mistress, without a grimace following it. Jonah found himself smiling back. It was a rusty expression, one his face had nearly forgotten. In the middle of the howling storm, a small, fragile thing passed between them. A moment of shared humor. It felt as strange and as real as a butterfly landing in a swirl of red dirt. The storm passed, but the larger storm, the one made of paper and ink, gathered force. The next day, banker Lyle rode out from town. He was a neat, precise man who smelled of bay rum and old money. He sat on his fine horse, looking down at Jonah, who stood in the dust. Lyle did not dismount. He said the drought was causing complications. The bank was worried about its investments. He informed Jonah that the terms of his loan were changing. The main note was being called due. Jonah had until the autumn cattle drive to pay the full amount. If he failed, the bank would seize the mother herd, the breeding stock. Losing the mother herd meant the end of the ranch. It was a death sentence. Jonah stood frozen, the dust from the sandstorm seeming to settle in his throat. This was the expansion of his trouble, his money, his land, and the future of his new children. All of it was balanced on a knife edge. Lyle rode away, leaving a toxic silence in his wake. Eliza had seen him. She had seen the look on the face of Jonah Hale. That evening, Jonah found her by the water trough, washing her face. He looked tired. He looked like a man at the end of his rope. He told her the situation. He did not mean to. The words just came out. The bank, the herd, the impossible timeline. Then he made a decision. It was not logical. It was born of desperation. He told her he could not hire a nanny. He could not spare the wages for another hand. But he needed her to stay. He offered her a new arrangement. Stay until the cattle drive. Help with the twins. Help with the ranch. He would double her daily wages. He would pay her in a lump sum after the drive, if the drive was successful. He set rules again. Strict rules. For her honor and for his. The town was watching. There would be no Miss Undertindo. She would remain in the shed. Eliza listened. This was more than a week. This was a season. This was a gamble on a desperate man. But it was also a lifeline. Double wages would pay her husband's debt and then some. She agreed. She looked at the main house, where the lamps remained unlit. Then she looked at the tack shed, which had become her small corner of the world. She had a job. She had a purpose. But a flicker of sadness passed through her eyes. The line Jonah had drawn was still there, thick and clear. She was needed, but she was not welcome. Not really. The ranch settled into a routine. The days were long, marked by the sun's slow burn across the sky. Mornings meant Eliza was out before dawn, airing the saddles and blankets, the leather cold and stiff in the high desert air. Jonah and Jesse Pike would ride out, checking the thin herds, their figures small against the vast, pale sunrise. Midday brought the chores closest to the house. Eliza learned the rhythms of the smokehouse, the sharp scent of hickory, and the slow work of mending fences near the corral. In the evenings, she would sit in the tack shed, the door open to the cooling air, and mend, by the low yellow light of an oil lamp. She stitched the children's worn clothes, her hands moving with a steady, practiced rhythm. The land around them was unforgiving. The grass was sparse, dotted with prickly cactus and the gray-green blur of sage. When the moon rose, it was sharp and bright, casting hard shadows. The cattle huddled together, their shapes dark against the silvered dust. It was a landscape that demanded strength, and it did not care if you had any to spare. The children, however, were not made of iron. They were soft, and they were searching for an anchor. They began to follow Eliza as she worked. They had stopped calling her Mistress Carter, the formal title sitting strangely in their small mouths. One afternoon, Nate, the quiet one, tugged on her sleeve and asked, "Aunt Liz, can you show me?" "Show you what, Nate?" He pointed to the lariat hanging by the door. So she took a length of old twine and sat with him in the dust, her calloused fingers, which Jonah had only seen muck stalls and lift feed sacks, moved with a delicate precision. She showed Nate how to tie the small, sliding knot, how to make the loop balance. He practiced for hours on the fence posts, his face tight with concentration. She sat with Nora on the porch steps, the little girl's dark hair a tangled mess. Eliza gently worked out the knots, her own hair pulled back in a simple bun. She showed Nora how to braid, how to cross the strands, her low voice patient, and she took them for walks, just to the edge of the dry creek bed. She pointed out the triangular tracks of a bobcat, so different from the rounded, heavy-pawed mark of a coyote. They were small, quiet lessons, but they were the first real lessons the children had known in weeks. They were lessons in seeing, not just in surviving. The drought had baked the land, turning the small irrigation ditches into deep, sun-hardened gullies. One hot afternoon, a calf, startled by a rattlesnake, scrambled and fell into one. Its frantic bleating echoed across the yard. Jonah and Eliza ran toward the sound. They found the calf wedged tight, its leg bent at an angle that made Eliza wince. The gully was deep and narrow, the clay walls like brick. Jonah's first instinct was action. He slid into the ditch, his boots slipping on the loose scree. He tried to get his shoulder under the calf, to heave it up with brute strength. The animal kicked, terrified. Jonah grunted, his face red with effort, but he could not get his footing. He was stuck as much as the calf. "Stop," Eliza said. Her voice was not loud, but it cut through the animal's cries. "You will break its leg, or your own." Jonah looked up, his frustration clear. "It is stuck fast." "Get out of the ditch," she ordered. He hesitated, and she snapped the words, "Get out!" She looked around, her eyes scanning. She grabbed a long, thick piece of timber left over from a mended fence. She jammed one end under the calf's belly, finding a purchase in the opposite bank. She looked at Jonah, who was now standing on the edge. "I need leverage. Put your weight on this end when I tell you." She positioned herself, bracing her feet. "Now." Jonah threw his weight onto the end of the timber. The heavy wood groaned. The calf lifted, just an inch. Eliza was already moving, using her free hand to scramble dirt under the calf, clearing its trapped legs. "Again," she commanded. They worked the pole like a giant lever. The calf, feeling the steady, upward pressure instead of panic, began to struggle, this time with purpose. On the third try, it scrambled free, tumbling onto the flat ground. It lay there for a moment, trembling, then got to its feet and ran to its mother. Jonah stood breathing heavily, his shirt soaked with sweat, his boots caked in clay. He had been trying to fight the gully. Eliza had used physics. He looked at her. She was already walking away to fetch a bucket of water. He had seen her strength. Now he had seen her mind. A few days later, Jonah had to ride to Cotton Creek for supplies. He needed winter boots for the twins, and he had no idea what size they wore. He told Eliza to come with him. The ride-in was quiet, the wagon wheels crunching on the dry road. When they entered the general store, Eliza holding Nate and Nora by the hand, the talk stopped. The usual collection of men gathered by the cold stove turned to look. One of them, a man whose own small ranch had failed, spat a stream of tobacco juice. He nudged his friend, his voice carrying clearly. "Well now, looks like Hale is doing his shopping. He brought the barn widow with him." Another man laughed, a low, ugly sound. "Heard she is gentle with the livestock." Eliza stopped. She felt the blood leave her face, then return in a hot, painful rush. Nora gripped her hand, her small body tense. At the counter, Jonah turned, His face went dark. His hand moved toward the heavy bag of flour, as if he meant to throw it. But Eliza spoke first. She had a small basket of eggs she had collected from the ranch's neglected chickens. She had been planning to trade them for sewing thread. She walked directly to the men. Her voice was not loud, but it was as cold and sharp as obsidian. "I am Mistress Carter," she said. She held up the few coins Mr. Hanson had just given her for the eggs. "This is my money. I earned it. It smells of hay and clean straw." She took a step closer, looking the first man in the eye. "It does not," she said, "stink of cheap whiskey and an idle mouth. Good day." There was a moment of pure, stunned silence. The man's mouth hung open. One of his friends coughed into his hand, his face suddenly red. Jonah, who had taken a step toward them, stopped. He watched Eliza turn her back on them, a small, straight figure in a worn black dress. He watched her walk to the boot display and calmly lift Nora onto her knee to measure her foot. He had seen men stand down a charging bull. He had never seen anything braver than what he just witnessed. He looked at her not as a widow or a hand, but as a woman. The small victory did not last. The danger on the plains was real. Jesse Pike found the proof of it in the north pasture. A steer, its ear horribly mutilated, the Hale brand H burned over with a crude, sloppy mark. Jesse brought the news back at dusk, his face grim. "It is Wade Kincaid. Has to be." "How do you know?" Jonah asked. His voice was flat. "The tracks," Jesse said, "found them by the creek bed. The horseshoes were nailed on backwards. It is an old rustler's trick, meant to confuse anyone following. He is sending a message." Jonah nodded, his jaw tight. Banker Lyle was strangling him from the town. Wade Kincaid, his bitter ex-foreman, was bleeding him from the plains. The ranch was caught. The tension returned, thicker than before. Jonah became silent, his fears locking him away. The whole ranch felt stuck. It felt, Eliza thought, like the windmill. The windmill stood over the house, a tall, silent skeleton. Its blades had not turned since the accident that took Jonah's sister. The gears were seized with rust and old, hardened grease. Without it, the well water had to be drawn by hand, a back-breaking chore. One bright, windy afternoon, Eliza had had enough of the silence. She found Jonah's tools and a can of lubricating oil. She tied her skirts up around her legs and she began to climb. The ladder was high, the rungs narrow. The wind tore at her, trying to pull her from her perch. Jonah saw her from the corral. He dropped the bridle he was mending and ran, his voice raw with disbelief and anger. "Get down from there. What in God's name do you think you are doing?" "Fixing it," she yelled back against the wind. She had reached the main gearbox. It was choked with filth. She used a scraper, her fingers, and half a rag to clean it. Then she applied the oil, forcing it into the joints. She put her boot against one of the giant blades and shoved. There was a sound like a scream. Metal on metal, a grotesque, protesting groan. Then, slowly, the blades began to move. They caught the wind. They turned, lurching at first, then finding their smooth, steady circle, lapped, lapped, lapped. A moment later, a rusty gush of water poured from the pipe into the high wooden trough. The rust cleared, and the water ran clean and sweet. Nate and Nora burst from the house, their faces alight. "It is moving! Aunt Liz, it is moving!" They danced under the splashing water. Jonah stood rooted to the ground. He had looked at that broken mill for 3 weeks and seen only his grief. He had seen failure. She had looked at it and seen a machine that was stuck. He had been staring at his own hands all morning. The tremor had come back. The one he got from the war. The one that came when the fear was high. He watched the water flow. He listened to the steady sound of the turning blades. He looked at his hand. It was perfectly still. That evening, the air was different. The sound of the windmill was a comfort, a new heartbeat for the ranch. They sat on the porch as the sun went down. Jonah in his chair, Eliza on the top step. The twins played in the dust nearby, their game quiet. "It was a foolish thing to do," Jonah said, his voice low, "climbing like that." "It worked," Eliza replied. He nodded, looking out at the horizon. "My father, he said he hated this ranch. He told me I was born for trouble. He put me on my first horse when I was 5, a full-grown stallion." Eliza turned, surprised. He never spoke of his past. "It threw me," Jonah said. A small, dry smile touched his lips. "Threw me clean off. I landed flat on my back, right in the middle of a fresh manure pile, head to toe." Eliza pictured it, the tall, stern rancher as a small, filthy boy. A laugh escaped her. It was a bright, clean sound in the dusk. "Well," she said, her voice shaking with suppressed humor, "I suppose even manure has to aim high now and then." It was just recognizing quality. Jonah turned and looked at her. He had expected a polite silence. He had not expected a joke. He felt a rusty, unfamiliar sound rumble in his chest. He laughed. It was the first time he had laughed since the funeral. In that moment, the sterile distance between them, employer and hand, vanished. But as the laughter faded, Jonah's familiar fear returned. He liked this. He liked her steadiness. He liked her quick, dry wit. He watched her lean down to correct Nate's grip on a stick. He felt something in his chest unclench. It terrified him. He was a man built on loss. He had lost men in his cavalry unit. He had lost his sister. He was losing his ranch. He could not, would not, attach himself to another person only to watch them be torn away. He could not let the children attach, either. She would leave. After the cattle drive, she would take her money and go. She had her own life to find. He had to keep the line. He had to keep them all safe. The land, however, did not care about his lines. The long, dry summer broke. The first rain of autumn was not a gentle mist. It was a cold, driving storm that hit the house like a fist. The wind howled. The dust turned instantly to thick, cold mud. That night, the temperature dropped. Jonah was in the barn, checking on the nervous calves, when he heard a cry. It was not from the storm. It was from the house. He ran, slipping in the mud. He burst into the children's room. Nora was sitting bolt upright in her bed. Her face flushed a terrible, deep red. Her breathing was shallow. She was burning with fever. In the next bed, Nate was coughing, a dry, barking sound that tore at his throat. Jonah's blood went cold. He touched Nora's forehead. She was as hot as a skillet. He was a rancher. He could set a bone. He could stitch a wound. He did not know how to fight this. He was frozen. He did the only thing he could. He ran to the porch, into the driving rain, and he yelled her name. Eliza. She came from the tack shed, her feet bare, her hair plastered to her face. She was soaked in an instant. "What is it?" "The children," he said, his voice cracking. "They are sick, a high fever." Eliza did not wait. She did not ask permission. She pushed past him, dripping water onto the clean kitchen floor. She crossed the line. The boundary Jonah had drawn in, the dust was washed away by the rain. She entered the children's room, and the panic in the air receded. She was in command. "Get me cold water," she snapped, "and cloths. Find the whiskey, and get these heavy blankets off them. They are too warm." Jonah, the ranch owner, the ex-soldier, simply obeyed. He ran, fetching and carrying. He watched her work. Her hands were firm, efficient, and impossibly gentle. She bathed their faces. She mixed honey and a bare drop of whiskey and forced Nate to swallow it, calming the terrible cough. She worked through the night, a small, damp figure in the dark house. Jonah sat in a chair in the corner, feeling large, useless, and filled with a dreadful, aching fear. She was in his house. She was saving his children, and he did not know what that meant. For 2 days, Eliza May Carter lived in the main house. The line Jonah Hale had drawn was gone, washed away by the fever and the driving rain. She did not sleep in the tack shed. She slept in a rocking chair by the twins' beds, a damp cloth in her hand. Jonah slept in a chair in the hall, his shotgun across his knees, listening to the three of them breathing. When the fever finally broke, the storm had passed. The dawn was quiet, the air scrubbed clean and cold. Nora woke up, her skin cool, and asked for a drink of water. Eliza's shoulders, which had been tense for 48 hours, finally slumped. She stood, her legs stiff, and walked to the kitchen. Jonah was there, standing by the cold stove. He looked as exhausted as she felt. He had not shaved. The scar on his jaw was a pale line against the dark stubble. They looked at each other in the gray light. The house was a mess. Blankets were piled on the floor. The scent of sickness and old fear hung in the air. He spoke first. His voice was rough. He said, "I made coffee." He handed her a tin cup. It was the first time they had shared a simple, domestic moment. She took it. Her hand was trembling. She said, "I should clean this." He shook his head. He said, "You should sleep." She nodded, finished the coffee, and walked to the door. She went back to the tack shed, back to her own small bed of hay. She had crossed the line to save them, but in the light of day, she did not know where she belonged. She fell asleep, the smell of straw and leather a familiar comfort. The ranch had survived the fever, but the peace did not last. Banker Lyle rode out 3 days later. News of the children's sickness had reached town, and it had given the banker an idea. He found Jonah by the corral. He did not dismount. He offered his sympathies, his voice smooth and insincere. A man with children, he said, a terrible burden, especially with your finances in such a precarious state. Jonah just watched him, his face impassive. Lyle said, "The bank is worried. Jonah, a drought, rustlers, and now sickness. We need more security. I am here to offer you a bridge loan, something to get you to the autumn drive." "A bridge to where?" Jonah asked. "To solvency." Lyle smiled. He pulled a sheaf of papers from his saddlebag. "Just a formality. The terms are simple. We will extend your credit, but we will require new collateral. Not the land, the breeding stock." Jonah's blood went cold. The mother herd, the core of his ranch, the future. Lyle said, "If you fail to meet the payment after the drive, we take the herd. Cleanly, no fuss. It is a simple business transaction." Eliza was in the barn, just inside the wide door, mending a harness. She could hear every word. She watched Jonah's back. She saw the set of his shoulders. He was trapped. He was a man with a pistol to his head, and the banker was telling him it was for his own good. She watched Jonah take the papers. He said he would read them. Later that evening, after Lyle was gone, Eliza found Jonah on the porch. He was staring at the papers, his face grim. She stood at the bottom step, not daring to cross onto the porch. She did not know if the line was back. She said, "He is not offering a loan. He is offering to steal your ranch for the price of one late payment." Jonah's head snapped up. His voice was sharp with fear and anger. "What choice do I have? What?" "You have me," she said. He stared at her. She clarified, her voice gaining strength. "You have my skills. The ones I told you about. Calving season is starting on the small ranches, the ones in the foothills. They cannot afford to lose a single calf. I'm good at it. Jonah, I can turn a breach. I can save a calf they think is lost. I can bring in cash. Quick cash." He looked at her as if she were mad. A woman, riding out as a cow doctor. The gossip would be venomous. Mrs. Abernathy would have a field day. Reverend Pierce would preach a sermon on it. He could hear their voices. A desperate man, so broken he was being run by his barn widow. He said, "The town, they will talk." Eliza's gaze was steady. It cut right through his pride. Let them talk. As long as Nate and Nora have supper, what does the talk matter? Their words are not as sharp as that banker's pen. He looked past her, at the big windmill turning slowly in the evening breeze. He thought of the two small, healthy bodies sleeping in the house. He gave one sharp nod. He said, "All right, but you will not go alone. Jesse will ride with you." They left before dawn 2 days later. Eliza had her small bag of remedies, clean ropes and a bar of lye soap. Jesse Pike rode beside her, his rifle in its scabbard, his expression calm. They were headed for the Crenshaw place, a small, struggling ranch set deep in the salt flats. The ride was desolate. The moon was a sliver, and the salt flats gleamed bone-white in the starlight. It was a dead, silent place. The air was heavy, charged, and strangely warm. Jesse looked at the horizon. Streaks of light were flashing, silent and quick, from a cloudless sky. "Dry lightning," he said, his voice low. "Heat lightning." Eliza watched it. It was beautiful and terrifying. It was nature showing its power, a silent, electric warning. It made her feel very small. It reminded her that the bankers and the rustlers were not the only enemies. The land itself was always watching, always waiting. They arrived at the Crenshaw ranch to a scene of quiet panic. Mr. Crenshaw was a small, worn-down man. His wife stood on the porch, wringing her hands. He had a heifer in the barn, his best one, and she was in trouble. The calf was breached. He had been trying for hours. He had given up. He told Jesse he was just trying to save the mother now. Eliza walked into the barn. The air was thick with the smell of sweat and fear. The poor animal was moaning, exhausted. Eliza took off her coat. Her voice was calm, but full of an authority that made Crenshaw stop his frantic pulling. "Boil water," she told his wife, "and bring me all the soap you have." She looked at Crenshaw. "Hold her head. Talk to her. Keep her steady." For the next hour, Eliza worked. This was not a miracle. This was hard, ugly, physical labor. She used the soap, her hands, the ropes. She braced her boots against the stall wall, using her entire body as leverage. She was patient. She rested when the heifer rested. She worked with the animal's rhythms, her voice a low, steady monotone. At last, with a final, desperate pull, the calf slid free. It landed on the straw, limp and blue. It was not breathing. Crenshaw cursed, a low, despairing sound. Eliza did not stop. She grabbed a handful of rough straw and began to rub the calf's sides, hard. She cleared its airway with her finger. She bent low and blew a sharp, quick puff of air into its nostrils. Nothing. She did it again. A tiny, wet sputter, a cough. The calf's legs gave a convulsive kick. It took a ragged, squealing breath. Mr. Crenshaw's wife began to cry, loud, sobbing gulps of relief. Crenshaw himself just stared, his mouth open. He walked over to Eliza, who was washing her arms in the bucket of hot water. He was holding silver dollars in his hand. He pressed them into her palm. He said, I never seen the like. "Ma'am, I thank you. I surely thank you." His eyes were not looking at a barn widow. He was looking at a person who had just saved his livelihood. On the ride back, Eliza held the coins in her pocket. They were heavy and real. The sun was coming up as they reached the edge of the Hale property. The mood was light. Jesse was telling her a story about a rodeo in Cheyenne. He stopped, mid-sentence. He held up his hand, signaling for silence. He dismounted. Up ahead, by the fence line, was a single Hale calf. It was standing unsteadily, its side matted with blood. They approached slowly. The calf's ear had been crudely cut, sliced almost to the root. It was not a brand. It was a mutilation. Jesse saw the flash of steel. Pinned to a fence post by a large skinning knife was a piece of dirty paper. He pulled the knife free. The blade was still sharp. He read the words scrawled in charcoal. "Weak herds get culled." "It is Wade Kincaid," Jesse said. His voice was flat and cold. "This is his mark." Eliza felt the silver dollars in her pocket suddenly go cold. This was not just theft. This was a threat. This was personal. They rode back to the ranch in silence. Jonah met them at the barn. Jesse handed him the note. Jonah's face, when he read the words, turned to granite. His brief hope, his small victory, was gone. He looked at Eliza, and she saw the old, cold fear back in his eyes. The news of the successful birth at the Crenshaw place spread through town, but the story became twisted. Some said it was witchcraft, others said it was unholy. On Sunday, Reverend Pierce did not wait for Jonah to come to church. He rode out to the ranch. He found Jonah reinforcing the corral gate, preparing for Wade's next move. Reverend Pierce said, "Mr. Hale, I must speak with you. The town is alarmed." "About what, Reverend?" Jonah asked, not stopping his work. "This woman, this Carter woman." He gestured toward the barn. "You allowed her into your home. We in the town, we tried to overlook it, given the circumstances, but now you send her riding across the county like a man, conducting business. It is a terrible example for your children. Jonah, it speaks of moral confusion." Eliza was inside the barn, pitching fresh hay. She was just close enough to hear every word. She froze, the pitchfork heavy in her hands. Each word was a stone. Moral confusion. A terrible example. She felt the old, familiar shame rise, the brand of the bad luck widow. She wanted to run, to scream, but she stood silent in the shadows, her knuckles white. Jonah stopped hammering. He turned, his movements slow and deliberate. He said, "My sister's memory is in that house, with my children, who are alive today because of Mistress Carter. You are welcome to stay for supper, Reverend, but you are not welcome to judge the people who live under my protection." Reverend Pierce looked shocked. He sputtered, but Jonah had already turned back to his work. The hammer blows were hard and final. The Reverend left, his back stiff with indignation. In the barn, Eliza let out a breath she did not know she was holding. Her knees felt weak. He had defended her. The children, now healthy, were a constant presence. They followed Eliza, chattering. One afternoon, while Jonah and Jesse were riding the fence line, Eliza found Nate and Nora sitting at a small crate, drawing with bits of charcoal on a piece of clean wrapping paper. When they saw her, they hid it, giggling. That evening, Jonah was standing by the fireplace. He had not lit a fire in the main parlor since his sister's death. The hearth was cold. Eliza brought him a cup of coffee. This had become their new ritual. It was not spoken of. She just did it. She stopped. The children's drawing was propped up on the mantelpiece. It was a simple, lopsided drawing. A square house, two small stick figures holding hands, Nate and Nora. In the center, taller than the house, was a stick figure with a triangle for a skirt. Eliza, and beside them all, a giant, spinning pinwheel with blades, the windmill. Jonah saw her looking at it. He said nothing. His face was unreadable in the dim light. Eliza expected him to take it down. It was a child's fantasy. It was a picture of a family that did not exist. Jonah took the coffee from her hand, his fingers brushing hers. He looked at the drawing for a long moment, then he turned away, leaving it exactly where it was. The threat from Wade Kincaid made the ranch feel like a fortress. Eliza and Jesse worked together constantly, checking the perimeter, reinforcing the fences. Jesse's easy. Quiet company was a comfort. He did not pry. He just worked. One afternoon, while they were stretching wire, Eliza, still smarting from the Reverend's words, found herself speaking. "They think I am bad luck. Jesse, the town, because my husband died poor. They think I am a stain." Jesse stopped hammering. He looked at her, his dark eyes serious. He said, "Mistress Carter, look at this land. It is hard. It does not care about your past. It does not care who your husband was. It only cares what you do right now. In this country, anyone who does the work, who stands their ground, they are good people. The rest," he tapped the fence post, that is just noise." His words settled in her. They were the truest thing anyone had said to her in a year. But the money from the calf births was not enough. It was a trickle. The debt was a flood. Jonah was forced to go to town. He had to sign banker Lyle's bridge loan. He had to sign away his herd. Eliza insisted on going with him. She brought the small, neat ledger book she had started, showing the new income. Banker Lyle's office was polished and dark. He smiled when he saw Eliza and her book. He said, "A quaint effort, Mistress Carter, but hardly a solution." He pushed the papers toward Jonah. Jonah signed. His hand cramped. As they were standing to leave, Lyle looked at Eliza. He leaned forward, his voice a confidential murmur. He said, "Mr. Hale, a thought. You are a man in distress. This woman, she is a burden on your reputation. A distraction. I have a contact at the Grand Hotel in Cheyenne. They are always looking for reliable kitchen staff. Long-term contracts, for a small fee. I could place her. Get her off your hands. Settle her. Permanently." The room went cold. The meaning was unmistakable. A contract, indentured, sold. Jonah, who had been pale with defeat, went rigid. His eyes, which had been downcast, lifted. They were flat and dangerous. His voice was a low growl. "You will not speak of her again." But before he could say more, Eliza stepped forward. She placed her small ledger book on the banker's polished desk. She looked Lyle directly in the eye. She said, her voice not loud, but as clear and cold as the water from the well, "Mr. Lyle, I am a widow. I am a ranch hand. I am, apparently, a midwife for cows." She tapped the ledger. "But I am not, nor will I ever be, for sale." She turned, her back straight, and walked out of the bank, leaving the ledger on his desk. Jonah looked at the banker one last time, a look of pure, cold contempt. Then he followed her out into the dusty street. The ride back from the bank was a journey through dust and defeat. Jonah Hale had signed the papers. He had put his children's future, the very animals that were their inheritance, into the hands of banker Lyle. The ranch felt less like a home and more like a trap, the days on the calendar clicking down like the mechanism in a lock. The tension was thick, brittle, and hot. Then the world caught fire. It did not start with a sound. It started with a smell, carried on a sudden, hot wind from the west. It was not the familiar scent of sagebrush or dry earth. It was the sharp, resinous perfume of burning pine. Jesse Pike saw it first. He had climbed the windmill to check the gears, which had begun to squeak again. He pointed to the western ridge. It was not a ridge anymore. It was a low, angry orange line, crowned with a plume of smoke that rose miles into the sky, blotting out the afternoon sun. "Dry lightning!" Jesse yelled, scrambling down the ladder. "It must have hit the high timber, and the wind is turning." Chaos bloomed. Jonah's voice cut through the rising panic. "Jesse, ride hard to the north pasture. Get the mother herd. Do not stop. Move them east, to the river flats. Now!" Jesse was on his horse and gone in a cloud of dust. "Eliza, the children, the well." Jonah grabbed a shovel and ran toward the barn, his mind calculating wind speed and tinder. The sky turned a sick, jaundiced yellow. Ash began to fall, not in gentle flakes, but in heavy gray particles, like a diseased snow. It coated the porch rails, the water trough, the children's hair. Eliza ran to the house. Nate and Nora were standing on the porch, paralyzed, their faces pale. She grabbed them. She ripped a clean bed sheet into 3 large squares and soaked them at the pump. "Breathe through this," she commanded, her voice leaving no room for argument. She tied the wet cloths over their small faces, the fabric smelling of lye soap and fear. Jonah was digging, his muscles straining, the shovel a blur. He was trying to cut a firebreak, a shallow trench of bare earth between the dry grass and the barn. But the wind was too strong. It was carrying hot embers, long distances, like advanced scouts of the main blaze. Sparks began to land in the yard, winking out in the dust, but more followed. The roar was audible now, a constant, deep-throated sound like a freight train crossing a high trestle. The air grew hot, thick, and hard to breathe. "The barn!" Jonah yelled, his voice raw. "The sparks are on the roof!" Eliza looked at the barn, then at the house. Her eyes scanned the property, past the corrals, to the small, mounded hill where the old root cellar was dug into the earth. It was cool, dark, and deep. She grabbed the children's hands. "Come with me." The weaning calves, the ones she had helped birth, were huddled against the corral fence, bleeding in terror. "Nate, help me. We have to move the calves." The boy, his eyes wide and dark above the wet cloth, did not hesitate. He ran, flapping his arms, pushing the small, panicked animals. Eliza pulled, and Nate pushed, herding them toward the dugout. Eliza threw open the heavy wooden door. Inside, "Get to the back." She shoved the children and the terrified calves into the dark, earthy smelling hole. She looked around, frantic, the heavy canvas tarp, the one used to cover the feed wagon. She ran to the pump, hand over hand, soaking the canvas until it was too heavy to lift. She dragged it, foot by foot, back to the cellar. Her lungs were burning. She draped the heavy, wet canvas over the wooden doors, sealing the entrance. The memory hit her, sharp and sudden. The boarding house in Leadville, the smell of smoke and wallpaper paste, the screaming in the hallway, the heat on the door. She had survived by crawling under a wet blanket and waiting for a rescue that never came. She had rescued herself. She looked at the children, their eyes white in the gloom. "Do not come out." She shook Nate's shoulder to make him understand. "No matter what you hear, no matter how long it takes, I will come back for you." Nora was crying, her sobs muffled by the cloth. Eliza hugged her, hard. "Be brave. Nora, be brave like your straw doll. I will be back." She left them in the safety of the earth and ran back into the storm of ash. The world was red and gray. The main house seemed safe for the moment, the wind pushing the worst of the flames around its solid frame. But the corrals, and the large warehouse where Jonah stored his feed, his cured hides, and his saddles, were in the direct path. "Jonah!" She screamed his name. The wind tore the word from her mouth. She could not see him. The smoke was too thick. Then she heard a shout, muffled and desperate. It was near the warehouse. A section of the burning corral fence had collapsed. He was down. "My leg!" His voice was choked. "The wire!" He had fallen against a new roll of barbed wire. It was a silver tangle, and he was caught in it. His leg was trapped, the barbs biting deep into his denim, holding him fast. He was pulling, but every movement just cinched the knots tighter. The warehouse wall just feet behind him was smoking, the wood darkening. Eliza ran to him. The heat was a physical blow, like an open furnace. "Do not pull!" she yelled over the roar. "Hold still!" She dropped to her knees, ignoring the hot embers on the ground. She needed wire cutters. They were in the barn, 100 yards away, an impossible distance. She used her hands. The barbs tore at her palms, ripping the skin, but she did not feel it. Her mind was cold, clear. She worked at the tangle, pushing one loop in to free another, unwrapping the wire from his boot. "It is caught deep," Jonah grunted, his face pale with pain under a mask of soot. "I see it." She found the main twist. She braced her foot and gave one violent, calculated pull, ignoring his sharp cry. The wire sprang free. "Now!" She grabbed his arm, pulling him up. As they stood, the wind turned again, a vicious, swirling downdraft. It sent a sheet of flame rolling up the warehouse wall. The building exploded, a wave of heat and light washing over them. Eliza shoved Jonah, hard, pushing him forward, turning her own back to the blast. She felt a searing, crackling pain. She screamed, her hair. They stumbled and fell together, rolling in the ash-covered yard, gasping for air as the warehouse roof caved in with a sound like thunder. They lay there, side by side, breathing the filthy air. The fire roared past them, moving on, hungry for the open grass to the east. When the worst had passed, Jesse returned. His face was black. The mother heard. He gasped. "They are safe, in the river flats." They took stock. The warehouse was gone. A smoking pile of embers. The barn was badly scorched. One side blackened, but it was standing. The main house, miraculously, was untouched. And the children, Eliza staggered to her feet and ran to the cellar. She tore away the now dry, smoking tarp and pulled open the doors. Nate and Nora tumbled out, coughing, crying, but whole, alive. Eliza knelt, hugging them, her body finally giving in to the tremors. She had done it. She walked back to the yard and sat down hard on the ground, the adrenaline leaving her in a sudden, sickening rush. She was covered in soot, ash, and the blood from her torn hands. She just lay back on the ash, staring at the alien, red sky. Jonah limped over to her. His leg was bleeding badly from the wire, but he did not seem to notice. He looked down at her. Her face was a streaked mess, and the side of her head, her thick, dark hair was gone on the left side, singed away to the scalp. The skin beneath was an angry, blistering red. His hand, the one that sometimes trembled from the war, was shaking. He reached down, his fingers hovering over the burn, afraid to touch it. He whispered, his voice broken, choked with smoke and something else. "You, Mistress Carter, you did not have to do that." Eliza turned her head, the burned skin pulling tight. She looked up at the man standing over her, his shadow a dark shape against the ruined sky. "Yes," she said, her voice a raw scrape, "I did." That night, the house was a hospital. The tax shed was unusable, the air too thick with soot. The children's room, though untouched, smelled of smoke, and they refused to sleep there. Eliza sat in the large armchair in the main living room, the one that had belonged to Jonah's father. She would not leave the twins, afraid the smoke had damaged their lungs. The line, the one Jonah had fought so hard to maintain, was gone. It had been burned from the ground. He cleaned and bandaged his own leg, his stitches rough but effective. Then he came to her. He knelt, his bad leg stiff, and took her hands. He cleaned the wire cuts and the burns, his touch surprisingly gentle. He winced when she flinched. He applied salve to her burned scalp, his fingers careful. They did not speak. The children were bundled in blankets at her feet, finally asleep. Jonah sat in the chair opposite her. The only light came from the fireplace and the red glow of the dying warehouse outside. He spoke first, his voice low, his gaze fixed on the fire. "My sister, Sarah. She was terrified of fire. Our first cabin, when we were children, it burned. She never forgot the smell." Eliza watched him, her own hands throbbing. "My husband, Henry, he was a good man, but he was not strong. He was sick for a long time, and he was afraid of failing me. He died owing money to a man I despise." Jonah looked at his own bandaged hands. "I was in the war. I was good at it. Giving orders, fighting. I was not good at this." He gestured to the sleeping children. "I am not good at keeping people safe." Eliza's voice was quiet. "I am paying Henry's debt, not for him, for me, so I can be free of it." They sat in the smoky darkness, trading these small, hard truths. They spoke of the people they had lost, the things that had burned them, in the parlor of the damaged ranch. A small, sturdy shelter of trust was finally being built. Jonah watched her. The firelight played on her face, highlighting the soot and the brave, stubborn line of her jaw. He felt a powerful, undeniable pull. It was more than gratitude. It was a feeling of rightness. She belonged in that chair. She belonged in his home. The thought terrified him. His first duty was to Nate and Nora. He was already failing them. He could not protect them from bankers, from rustlers, from nature itself. What right did he have to this feeling, this warmth? Love was a risk he could not afford. Love was a vulnerability. He had seen what happened when you loved something. It was taken from you. His fear of being a failed father, a failed man, was a cold hand gripping his heart. It was choking this new, fragile thing before he could even give it a name. The real world returned 2 days later, riding a fine horse, banker Lyle. He surveyed the smoking ruin of the warehouse, the scorched barn. He clicked his tongue, a sound of false sympathy. A terrible setback. Hale, terrible. The bank is, of course, deeply concerned. The herd is fine, Jonas said, his voice flat. For now, Lyle said, his eyes cold. But this is a significant loss of assets. The warehouse, the feed, the saddles, the collateral is compromised. What do you want, Lyle? The bank feels, given the instability of your situation, we must accelerate the timeline. We cannot wait for the autumn drive. 10 days. Hale, you have 10 days to produce the full payment, or I will be back with Sheriff Duplass to seize the herd. 10 days. It was a death sentence. It was impossible. As Lyle rode away, the second blow struck. Jesse returned from town, his face a mask of cold fury. It is Wade Kincaid, Jesse said, spitting into the ash. He is in the saloon, running his mouth, spreading poison. What poison? Eliza asked, her hand going to her burned scalp. Jesse looked at her, his eyes full of pity and anger. He is telling everyone, ma'am, he is saying the fire was convenient. He is saying it did what you could not, that it moved you from the barn to the house. He is telling them you slept your way in. Eliza felt the blood drain from her face. She had fought fire. She had saved his children. She had scars, and this was her reward. The town would believe him. The gossips had their proof. That night, Eliza did not sleep. She sat in the parlor chair, the weight of the town's judgment, Lyle's impossible deadline, and Kincaid's vicious lies pressing down on her. The children, sensing the new wave of despair, refused to sleep in their own beds. They crept into the parlor. Nora climbed onto her lap, tucking her head under Eliza's chin. Nate curled at her feet, his head resting on her knee. They fell asleep like that, a small, broken family clinging to each other in the dark. Jonah came downstairs before dawn. He had not slept either. He walked into the living room, his mind racing, trying to find a way out where there was none. He stopped. The first gray light of morning was coming through the window. It illuminated Eliza in the armchair. She was fast asleep, her head tilted back against the chair, her face pale and exhausted. Her singed hair was a dark, ragged patch. A fine layer of ash from the fire still clung to her clothes. And in her arms, held fast even in sleep, were his children. He had seen this image once before, in the barn, a tableau of desperation and need. He was seeing it now in his home. This was not desperation. This was foundation. This was permanence. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. This woman, who had faced down gossip, bankers, and open flames, who had her reputation torn to shreds for his sake, was not just making his house run. She was making it whole. She was holding his world together with her own 2 scarred hands. She stirred, her eyes opening, blurred with exhaustion. She saw him watching. A flush rose on her soot-stained cheeks, and she started to move the children. They were cold. Jonah took a step forward. His heart was hammering against his ribs. He wanted to say it. Do not leave. Stay with me. Stay with us. The words choked him. The fear was too strong. 10 days. Kincaid. The ruin. He could not ask her to tie herself to a sinking ship. He could not ask her to share his name when he had nothing left to offer. So he said the only thing he could, the small, inadequate truth. Thank you. Eliza looked at him for a long moment. She saw the war in his eyes. She saw the words he could not say. A small, weary smile touched her lips. She nodded toward the window. where the morning light was just catching the high, turning blades. "The windmill is turning! Jonah!" He nodded, understanding her meaning. It was not broken. Not yet. The fire had passed, but the smoke lingered. It clung to the curtains, the furniture, and the heavy silence between Jonah and Eliza. The 10-day deadline from Banker Lyle was a physical weight, pressing the air from the house. They had survived the flames, only to be cornered by a piece of paper. Eliza had spent the past 2 nights in the parlor armchair, but it was not a sustainable solution. Her back ached, and the children, sensing her exhaustion, were restless. On the 3rd morning, Jonah met her in the kitchen as she was trying to scrub the soot from her hands with harsh lye soap. He held something out to her, a small iron key. It was dark in the hallway, his face unreadable. He said, "There is a spare room, upstairs, next to the twins. It is small, but the bed is sound." Eliza stopped scrubbing. She looked at the key, then at him. He cleared his throat. "The sound rough. For your medicines, for the children. It is not right, you sleeping in a chair. You need a place to store your things." It was a clumsy excuse. They both knew it. The line he had drawn, the one the fire had blurred, was now being formally erased by his own hand. He was not just giving her a room. He was inviting her into the structure of his family. She dried her raw hands on her apron. She took the key. Her fingers were steady. She said, "Thank you, Jonah." She moved her few belongings from the tack shed that afternoon. Her spare dress, her sewing kit, and the small, worn Bible that had belonged to her mother. As she walked up the main staircase, Reverend Pierce was just leaving. He had come to check on the family's moral fortitude after the fire. He saw Eliza on the stairs. He saw the key in her hand. He saw the bundle under her arm. His face, which had been arranged in lines of pastoral concern, tightened into a mask of pure disapproval. "Mistress Carter," he said, his voice cold, moving up in the world. Jonah stepped out of the parlor. He stood at the base of the stairs, looking up at Eliza, then down at the Reverend. "She is," he said. His voice was quiet, but it was not apologetic. "She is storing medical supplies. Reverend, for my children, unless you would prefer she nurse them from the barn." Reverend Pierce's face flushed. He saw the hard, unyielding set of Jonah's jaw. He saw the new, unshakable loyalty in the man's eyes. He adjusted his hat. "A house must be in order, Mr. Hale. That is all I will say." He left. Jonah watched him go, then looked back up at Eliza. She had not flinched. She simply continued up the stairs, the sound of her opening the spare room door. The click of the lock was the only sound in the house. With a room of her own, Eliza's energy seemed to double. She would not let the 10-day deadline defeat them. She took the small, hard coins she had earned from the Crenshaw berth and bought a new ledger book at the general store. She was not just a hand. She was a business. She and Jesse Pike rode out every day. The news of her skill had spread. She was the Calving Widow, a name that held a mixture of suspicion and awe. She rode to the small, struggling ranches that Banker Lyle was also squeezing. The families who could not afford to lose a single head. She saved their calves. She took payment in cash, in feed, in promises of future stock. And she kept her books. Every night, at the kitchen table, under the light of the oil lamp, she wrote. Jonah would sit across from her, cleaning his rifle, pretending not to watch. He saw the neat columns, the careful addition. One night, she looked up, her finger tracing a line of figures. "Jonah, this cash is not enough. It is a bucket, and Lyle is the whole river. We cannot pay him in 10 days. Jonah's hand stilled. He knew it, but hearing her say it aloud felt like a new betrayal. "Then what is the point?" "The point," she said, leaning forward, her eyes intense, "is the next loan. We use this," she tapped the book. "We show him we have a new source of income, a new asset. My skill. We offer him contracts. Jonah, contracts for the calves I am saving. We negotiate a new rate, a new timeline, based on future earnings. We prove the ranch is worth more than he thinks, not less. He stared at her. He had been thinking only of survival. She was thinking of strategy. The days found a new, stranger rhythm. They were a team. In the afternoons, Eliza would sit with Nora on the porch, showing her how to darn a sock, her hands, still scarred from the fire, moving with a seamstress's grace. Jonah, meanwhile, would take Nate out beyond the corral. Eliza would watch from the window as he showed the boy how to hold a rifle, how to respect it, how to check the chamber, his voice low and serious. He was teaching the boy responsibility, not violence. They were two parents, doing the quiet, necessary work of raising children, even if the words for it had not been spoken. That Sunday, Jonah hitched the wagon. He told Eliza and the children to get dressed. "Where are we going?" Eliza asked. "Town," he said, "for supplies and for church." The idea terrified her. The gossip, Wade Kincaid's lies, Reverend Pierce. Jonah saw the fear in her eyes. He said, "You are living in my house. You are caring for my children. You are not a secret. Eliza, put on your bonnet." The town stared. Wade Kincaid was in the saloon, and he laughed, a loud, jeering sound, as they walked past Mrs. Abernathy, standing on the steps of the general store, simply turned her back. Reverend Pierce was waiting, as if he knew they would come. He stood on the church steps, his Bible in his hand, blocking the door. "Mr. Hale," he said, his voice loud enough for the gathering congregation to hear, "I must ask you, as a man of God, to reconsider. You cannot bring this source of gossip into the house of the Lord." People stopped. This was not a private word. This was a public challenge. Jonah stopped at the bottom step. He looked up at the Reverend. His voice was calm, conversational, but it carried in the still morning air. "Reverend," he said, "my children are healthy because of this woman. My windmill is turning because of this woman. And my ledger," he added, "has black ink in it because of this woman. This house," he pointed to the church, "turns no one away. Is that not correct?" Reverend Pierce sputtered. "It is a matter of propriety." Jonah nodded. "Then I will be proper." He looked at Eliza. "Mistress Carter." He held out his arm. Eliza, her face pale but her head held high, laid her hand on his arm. They walked up the steps, together. Reverend Pierce, his face purple, had no choice but to step aside. The town did not know what to do. Some, like Mrs. Abernathy, turned and left, but others, the small ranchers Eliza had helped, the ones who had seen her work, they watched her walk in. And a few of them, quietly, followed. The foundation of public opinion had a crack in it. But Wade Kincaid would not be defeated by a church service. He was a creature of violence, not words. 2 days later, Jesse Pike did not come back from his ride. Jonah found him an hour past dusk, crawling by the side of the trail, dragging his leg. His horse was dead, its neck broken. "A trap!" Jesse grunted, his face slick with sweat and pain. It was not a wolf trap, it was a bear trap, heavy, with teeth, hidden in the dust. The horse never saw it. Jesse's leg was mangled. The steel teeth had torn through his boot and his calf muscle, stopping just short of the bone. They carried him back to the house. Eliza, her face a cold, pale mask, went to work. This was not a fever. This was a wound of war. She cleaned it, stitched it, and bound it, her movements precise, angry. She found Jonah in the barn, his hands clenched so tight his knuckles were white. She was shaking, not with fear, but with a cold, pure rage. "This was not for a cow," she said, her voice low. "That trap was for a horse, for a man. He knew Jesse rode that trail. He was trying to cripple you. Jonah, he was trying to kill your only hand." Jonah said nothing, his face dark. She stepped closer. "He is not just stealing your cattle anymore. He is not just spreading lies. He is trying to bleed you dry. He is attacking your men. He is attacking your name." She was right. This was an escalation, a declaration. That night, the house felt like a powder keg. Jesse was asleep, his breathing shallow, a bottle of laudanum by his bed. The children were asleep, their doors closed. The 10-day deadline was just 4 days away. Jonah and Eliza were in the parlor, cleaning. The fire had left a fine layer of ash over everything, and the room still smelled of cinders. They worked in silence. The scrub brush in Eliza's hand a weapon, the rag in Jonah's a burden. The air was so thick with unspoken fear and anger. Eliza felt she would choke on it. Jonah was trying to beat the dust from a heavy velvet pillow from the sofa. He hit it, and a cloud of gray ash exploded, covering the front of his shirt. He coughed, waving his hand. Eliza, her nerves stretched to the breaking point, let out a small, choked laugh. "You look like you lost a fight with a chimney." Jonah looked down at his shirt, then at her. A small, tired smile touched his face. "You do not look much better. You have a soot mustache." She swiped at her face, which only made it worse. He laughed, a short, rusty sound. It broke the tension. Suddenly, all the exhaustion, all the fear, poured out of them in a gust of helpless, slightly hysterical laughter. "Eliza, giddy with it. Grab the pillow. Give it to me. You are only making it worse." "No," he said, a real smile breaking through, the first she had seen in days. He grabbed it back. "It is my duty." "I will not have you failing at one more thing," she joked, her voice sharp with affection. She tugged. He tugged back, pulling her off balance. She stumbled against him, and the two of them, in a ridiculous, dusty tangle, fell. They collapsed onto the wide, horsehair sofa, which tipped, sending them tumbling backward onto the soft bearskin rug in front of the cold hearth. Jonah landed first, the wind knocked out of him. Eliza landed on top of him, the dusty pillow trapped between them. The laughter died instantly. The parlor was silent. All she could hear was his breathing, unsteady and quick. All she could feel was the solid, warm strength of him beneath her. The air was no longer filled with ash. It was electric. He looked up at her, his gray eyes searching her face. He did not move. He did not push her away. Eliza, her heart hammering against her ribs, looked down at him. This man, who had been so broken, so distant, this man who had defended her, who had given her his arm, who was fighting a war on all sides. She felt a sudden, fierce wave of everything. Anger at Lyle, rage at Kincaid, and a deep, aching tenderness for the man beneath her. She pushed a dusty strand of hair from her face. She was so tired, tired of fighting, tired of being the barn widow, tired of the rules. She rolled off him, her body tense. She sat up and turned away, her back to him. "What is it?" he asked, his voice rough. "This," she said, her fingers going to the laces at the side of her bodice. "This." She was wearing a simple, sturdy work corset. It was not for fashion. It was for support. It was a uniform, an armor. And she hated it. She hated the confines of it. She hated the way it bound her, just as the town tried to bind her, just as Lyle tried to bind him. With a small, angry sob of frustration, her fingers clumsy, she unlaced it. The rigid whalebone gave way. She pulled the heavy, stiff garment from under her dress and threw it onto the floor. It landed by the fireplace with a soft, dull thud. She took a deep, shuddering breath, the first real breath she had taken all day. She turned back to him. He had risen on one elbow. He was watching her, his face a mixture of confusion and a raw, unguarded awe. He understood. This was not about him. This was about her. She knelt beside him on the rug, her dress loose, her hair falling from its pins. She looked at him, her eyes clear. He did not move. He just watched her. She touched his face, her scarred fingers tracing the line of his jaw, the old, white scar. He closed his eyes, his voice a ragged whisper, barely audible. "Eliza, I am helpless." He opened his eyes. They were dark, full of surrender. "And I do not want saving." She leaned down. She did not kiss him. She just rested her forehead against his, breathing in the scent of him, dust and soap, and the faint, cold smell of the night. He lifted his hand, the one that no longer trembled, and laid it against her back, his fingers spreading wide, holding her. They stayed like that for a long, quiet moment, a silent promise made in the ruins of the parlor. The next morning, the world felt new and terrifying. They met in the kitchen, the light too bright, the sounds of the children stirring upstairs too loud. They were shy, awkward, like two teenagers who had been caught holding hands. Eliza poured his coffee, her hands shaking. She could not meet his eyes. Jonah took the cup, his fingers brushing hers. He did not let go. Eliza looked up, a flush staining her cheeks. Her voice was a nervous whisper. "You must not tell anyone that you lost a wrestling match to a widow." Jonah's expression was serious. His thumb moved over her knuckles. He said, "I did not lose. Eliza." He lifted her hand to his lips and kissed her scarred knuckles. "I chose to." The act was more intimate than anything that had happened the night before. It was a pledge. It was consent. Later that morning, Eliza walked onto the porch. The air was cool and bright. She stood there for a moment, her new, unbound dress moving in the breeze. She unpinned the scrap of black mourning ribbon from her sleeve. She had worn it for over a year. It was a part of her. She looked at it, the fabric faded and worn. She thought of Henry, her lost husband, with a distant, gentle sadness. She did not throw the ribbon away. She folded it, carefully, and tucked it into a small, empty bird's nest that was wedged in the rafters of the porch roof, just above the front door. It was a release, but not an erasure. Her past was now a part of the house, not a burden on her wrist. She turned, her hands free, and walked back inside to make breakfast. The new intimacy in the house was as fragile as a clean pane of glass. It was felt in the morning, when Jonah and Eliza met in the kitchen, their hands brushing as he took the coffee cup from her. It was a shared, silent acknowledgement of the night on the parlor floor, a secret that hung in the air, sweet and uncertain. They were a team, a partnership, and something more, something neither of them was ready to name. This fragile peace was shattered by the sound of approaching horses. It was not one rider, it was two. Banker Lyle, and beside him, wearing his badge, was Sheriff Duplass. Jonah stepped onto the porch, Eliza right behind him. Jonah's hand rested on the porch column. He did not look relaxed. Lyle smiled, a thin, satisfied expression. He did not dismount. He said good morning. Hail. He said he had unfortunate news. He was calling the loan. Not in 10 days. Today. Jonah's blood went cold. He said Lyle could not do that. He said they had an agreement. Lyle said, "A new development has made that agreement null and void." He held up a sheaf of papers. "It seems," he continued, his eyes sliding past Jonah to rest on Eliza, "that you are in violation of your loan's moral turpitude clause." Jonah stared. He asked what that meant. "It means," Lyle said, his voice dripping with false regret, "that by housing an unmarried woman of ill repute, by engaging in public cohabitation, you have damaged the property's moral standing and therefore its financial value." He nodded toward the sheriff. "I have affidavits from concerned citizens, from Reverend Pierce himself." He said, "The bank cannot abide such behavior. We are foreclosing immediately. Sheriff Duplass is here to serve the papers." Jonah looked at the sheriff, a man he had known for 10 years. The sheriff would not meet his eyes. He just held out the paper. Lila added, as a final twist of the knife, that the railroad had already made a generous offer for the land, contingent on a clean title. He said he was truly sorry, but business was business. Jonah was a soldier. He knew how to fight men with guns. He did not know how to fight men with paper. He felt the ranch, his sister's legacy, his children's future, sliding out from under him. He took the paper, his hand numb. They rode away, leaving a toxic, profound silence. Jonah walked into the house and sat heavily at the kitchen table. He laid the foreclosure notice flat, staring at it as if it were a death warrant. He was beaten. Eliza took the paper. She read it. Her eyes narrowed. She read the names on the affidavits. The Reverend, 2 men she had seen in the saloon. She read the legal language. Moral turpitude devalues the asset. She put the paper down. She said, "He is lying." Jonah looked up, his voice dead. "He has the sheriff. He has the papers." She said, "He is using gossip as a weapon. He is calling me a liability." She stood up, her anger a sudden, cold fire. "I will prove I am an asset." She went to the small desk in the parlor and returned with her ledger book, the one she had bought in town. She opened it. She said, "We are not going to fight him in his bank. We are going to fight him in the town. He has 2 affidavits. I will get 10. Jonah looked at her, confused. She pointed to the book. "Mr. Crenshaw, the Harris family, the Martins. I saved their stock. I brought in cash. My work has increased the value of this ranch, not decreased it. We will get their testimony. We will get them to sign papers saying what my skills are worth. We will fight his lie with the truth." A flicker of something returned to Jonah's eyes. It was not hope. It was the will to fight. He nodded. He said he would go see Duplass first. He would show him the evidence from Wade Kincaid's attack on Jesse. He had the captured rustlers in his smokehouse, tied and waiting. The sheriff was in his office, his boots on his desk. Jonah explained the situation, the branding fire, the attack, the men he had captured. Sheriff Duplass listened, his expression bored. He said, "Well, Jonah, that sounds like a personal dispute. He said he could not arrest Wade Kincaid based on the word of one rancher against another. He said Wade had been in the saloon all week, and he had witnesses. He said his hands were tied." Jonah looked at the man, at the lie sitting plain on his face. He knew then the law was not his. It belonged to the bank. He left the office, the captured rustlers a useless burden. He had to let them go. He returned to the ranch with the bitter news. They were on their own. Eliza did not waver. She said, "Then we start with the ranchers." She told Jonah to watch the twins. She would ride to the Crenshaw place. The day was bright, one of those warm, golden days of late autumn, a false summer before the bite of winter. The children were playing near the woodpile, where Eliza had been stacking logs for the kitchen stove. Nora was showing Nate her straw doll, the one Eliza had made that first night. Eliza was in the yard, hanging laundry on the line. She was pinning one of Jonah's shirts, the fabric smelling of soap and the clean, mineral scent of the well water. The windmill turned above her, its rhythm the steady heartbeat of the ranch. She heard a sound. It was not a yell. It was a shriek, a thin, breathless sound of pure, animal terror. She turned. Nate was standing frozen, his arm extended, pointing at the woodpile. Nora was on the ground. She was clutching her ankle, her face a mask of white shock. She was not crying. She was not making a sound. Eliza saw it, a movement by the wood, the thick diamond-patterned body of a prairie rattler, its head pulling back, its tail a furious, buzzing blur. It slid, heavy and angry, back into the dark spaces between the logs. Eliza ran. She did not think. She scooped Nora into her arms. The child's body was limp, her eyes wide with shock. On her small calf, just above the boot line, were 2 small, dark punctures, already beginning to swell. Eliza screamed Jonah's name, a sound ripped from her throat. She carried Nora into the kitchen, laying her on the table. Her mind was a cold, clear machine. She grabbed a clean dish rag and ripped it, tying a strip of cloth tight above Nora's knee, a soft tourniquet. Jonah burst through the door, his face ashen. He had heard the scream. He asked what happened. What was it? Eliza's voice was flat, hard. A rattler, in the woodpile. Jonah looked at his daughter, his only daughter, and his face crumpled. The doctor, I will get the doctor. It is too far, Eliza said. Already moving. She will not make it. She ran to her room, the room Jonah had given her. She grabbed her small cloth bag, the one with her remedies. She pulled out a hard, dark, dried root, echinacea, the plant the Ute had called snake root. She put a piece in her own mouth, her teeth grinding it into a rough, wet poultice. The taste was bitter, and her tongue went numb. She ran back to Nora and spat the poultice directly onto the bite, covering it with a clean cloth. Nora's breathing was shallow. Her leg was turning a mottled, ugly color. This is not enough, Eliza said. Her eyes met Jonah's. The anti-venom. The doctor is the only one who has it. He said he would ride. Eliza shook her head. You stay with Nate. He is terrified. I am smaller. I am faster. I know the shortcuts. Saddle Daisy. He did not argue. He ran to the barn. When he returned, Eliza was wrapping Nora in a heavy blanket. She carried the child out. Jonah lifted the small, limp body, his big hands trembling, and handed her up to Eliza, who was already mounted. He grabbed the horse's bridle, his face a mask of such raw terror that Eliza's heart ached. He looked up at her. All his walls gone, all his fear, his old losses, right there in his eyes. His voice broke. Do not, he choked on the words. Do not let them take another one. Eliza, do not let them take her from me. Eliza leaned down, her face inches from his. She put her hand on his cheek. Her voice was a vow. I will not. She spurred the horse. Daisy leaped forward, flying across the yard, leaving Jonah and Nate standing alone in a cloud of dust. She rode not for the town, but for the doctor's house, which was 2 miles closer. She cut across the dry riverbed, her body hunched over Nora's, shielding her from the wind. She arrived, her horse breathing hard, and pounded on the doctor's door. His wife answered, her face full of worry. He is not here, she cried. He was called to town, to the boarding house. Mrs. Abernathy's boy. He has a terrible fever. He cannot breathe. Eliza did not wait. She got back on the horse, her heart a cold stone. She rode into Cotton Creek, right to the boarding house, and did not bother to tie the reins. She burst through the front door, Nora in her arms. The scene in the main parlor was one of chaos. Mrs. Abernathy was weeping in a corner, her hands over her face. The doctor was bent over a small boy on the sofa. It was her youngest son, Timothy. His face was blue. His chest was heaving, but no air was getting in. The doctor was trying to clear his throat with a finger, but the boy was rigid, his airway blocked. The doctor looked up, his face slick with sweat. He said, It is the fever, a respiratory paralysis. The mucus is too thick. I cannot clear it. He is choking. Eliza laid Nora on a clean patch of floor. She looked at the boy. She looked at the doctor. She saw a vase on the mantelpiece, filled with long, decorative dried reeds. She grabbed one, a thick, hollow straw. She pulled a knife from her boot, the one she used for cutting twine, and sliced a clean 6-inch section. She pushed the doctor. Get out of the way. She tilted the boy's head back, forced his mouth open, and slid the hollow reed into his throat, past the blockage. It was a desperate, terrible gamble. She put her mouth to the end of the reed and blew a single, sharp, controlled puff of air. There was a wet, gurgling sound. The blockage in the boy's throat moved. She blew again. Timothy's body convulsed. He gave a terrible, retching cough, and the blockage came free. He gulped, his lungs seizing, and then he took a ragged, screaming breath, a sound of pure, agonized life. Mrs. Abernathy screamed and fainted. The doctor stared at Eliza as if she were a ghost. He was breathing as hard as the boy. He asked, My God, woman, Where did you learn that?" Eliza was already turning away, her voice sharp. "I saw a cavalry surgeon do it once, for a man who swallowed a bee. My patient is on the floor." The doctor, humbled and shocked, knelt by Nora. He saw the swelling, the tourniquet, the dark poultice. He nodded, his face grim. He said, "You did everything right, Mistress Carter, everything." He opened his bag and pulled out his syringe and the small vial of anti-venom. He administered the shot. He said, "She is strong. The ride was fast. And you," he looked at the route she had used. "You bought her the time she needed. She will live." When Mrs. Abernathy came to, the story was already formed. She did not see the barn widow. She saw the woman who had just breathed life back into her son. She crawled across the floor, grabbed Eliza's hands, the hands that were scarred from the fire, and wept. She thanked her. She blessed her. She begged her for forgiveness. The town, represented by the gossips in the boarding house parlor, had seen it. The tide had not just turned. It was a flood. While Eliza was in town, Jonah could not sit still. His daughter was gone. His ranch was gone. All that was left was the fight. He and Jesse, who was limping but functional, took their rifles and rode out. They were not checking fences. They were hunting. They smelled the smoke near the western ridge. Not a wildfire, a branding fire. They tethered their horses and crept to the edge of a small, hidden arroyo. Below them, Wade Kincaid and 2 other men were working. They had a dozen Hale steers, their legs tied. The Hale brand was being burned over. The H turned into a crude, ugly symbol. Jonah saw red. He and Jesse did not make a plan. They just opened fire. The element of surprise was total. The rustlers scattered. Jesse shot one man in the leg. The other threw down his gun. Wade Kincaid was not a coward. He drew and ran for his horse. Firing back, Jonah met him. The 2 men crashed together, falling from their saddles, rolling in the dust. It was not a fist fight. It was a brawl. Wade was strong, fueled by pure malice. He got the upper hand, pinning Jonah, his knife flashing. He raised it for a final, killing blow. Jesse, seeing it, threw himself forward. He grabbed Wade's arm, but his bad leg buckled. The knife, meant for Jonah's heart, plunged deep into Jesse's shoulder. Jesse cried out, the pain from his leg and the new wound overwhelming. The distraction was all Wade needed. He shoved Jesse off, kicked Jonah hard in the ribs, and scrambled onto his horse. He looked down at them, his face bloody, his eyes full of hate. He told Jonah this was not over. He would be back. He would finish it. He would burn him to the ground. He spurred his horse and disappeared over the ridge. Eliza returned at sunset. She was riding slowly. Nora asleep in her arms, weak but breathing evenly. Jonah met her on the porch. He was a mess. His shirt was torn. His ribs were aching, and he had a crude bandage on his arm where a stray bullet had grazed him. He just looked at his daughter, his eyes drinking her in. He touched her cheek. She is alive," Eliza whispered, her body aching with exhaustion. "She is safe." He took Nora from her, his touch infinitely gentle. He carried her inside. Later, after Jesse was stitched up for the second time, after Nate was reassured, after Nora was settled in her own bed, Eliza and Jonah stood on the porch. The crisis was over. The night was quiet. The only sound was the steady, gentle turning of the windmill. Jonah stood beside her, not touching her. He was looking out at the dark plains. He spoke, his voice low, the words torn from him. "When you rode away today, with her." He stopped. He turned to face her. He said, "I was not thinking about Lyle. I was not thinking about the ranch. I realized I am not afraid of being poor." His voice dropped to a whisper. "I am afraid of you not being here." Eliza's heart, which had been racing all day, seemed to stop, then start again, slow and steady. She was too tired to be shocked. It was just the truth. She looked at his bruised face, at the fear still lingering in his eyes. She reached out her hand, the one not cut by the wire, and laid it on his arm. She said, "We have both lost enough. Jonah." The air between them was quiet, but it was full. They had faced down the banker, the town, the rustlers, and the land itself. The 10-day deadline was almost meaningless now. They had allies. They had prisoners. They had the truth. Jonah knew he could not offer her anything. Not a name. Not a future. Not yet. He said, "Eliza, after this is over, after we settle this, after the cattle drive, we need to talk. Seriously, there are things I need to ask you." She knew what he was asking. She saw the humble, desperate hope in his eyes. She smiled, a small, weary smile that reached her eyes. She told him, "I will be here. Jonah, I will be here for the talk." The air over the high plains was not just hot, it was heavy. It was a strange, toxic yellow, and it smelled of ozone and damp dust. A storm was coming. Not a cleansing rain, but a violent electric clash of hot and cold. This was the day. It was the last day. Banker Lyle's foreclosure hearing was set for the following morning, but Jonah Hale was making his last, desperate move. He, Eliza, and a grim-faced Jesse Pike were moving the herd. It was a thin herd, scarred by drought and rustlers, but it was all they had. If they could get them to the small stockyard at the rail spur, they could sell them for just enough cash to stop the foreclosure. It was a long, thin, improbable thread of hope. Jonah rode point, his face set in stone. Jesse, his leg tightly bound and his shoulder a blaze of pain. Road drag, pushing the stragglers. Eliza rode flank on Daisy, a lantern tied to her saddle horn, her eyes scanning the horizon. The children were back at the ranch, locked in the house, under the new, watchful, and deeply protective care of Mrs. Abernathy, who had arrived at dawn with a shotgun and a basket of food. The cattle were nervous. They could feel the pressure drop. They lowed, their horns clacking, their bodies bunching together. Then the sky split open. The first crack of thunder was not a rumble. It was an explosion. It sounded like it was right inside their heads. A bolt of dry lightning hit the ridge to the west, momentarily turning the world white and purple. The cattle stopped. They froze. And from the ridge, a new sound, a human yell. Wade Kincaid. He was not alone. He had his 2 men, the ones Jonah had been forced to release. They were silhouetted against the boiling, greenish sky. Wade was not there to steal. He was there to scatter. He was there to fulfill his promise to burn Jonah to the ground. He raised his pistol and fired a shot into the air. The sound of the gun, coming an instant after the thunder, was the final, breaking point. The herd's terror turned to blind, mindless panic. The stampede began. It was not a run, it was an avalanche. A solid wall of horns and hooves and 1,000-pound bodies, moving as one, their bellows a single, terrifying roar. They were running blind, running toward the deep. Rocky Canyon lands to the east. Jonah screamed, spurring his horse, trying to get in front, to turn the leaders. It was useless. He was a piece of driftwood in a flood. Jesse, from the rear, saw where they were headed. A narrow box canyon. If they went in, they would pile up. They would be crushed, destroyed. His face was white with pain and effort, but he spurred his own horse, his bad leg useless, trying to cut across the mouth of the arroyo, to block them. Eliza saw the leaders. She saw Jonah, swallowed by the chaos. She saw Jesse, a small, limping figure, trying to head off a landslide. She lit her lantern. The small, protected flame glowed yellow in the strange, green light. She did not ride against the herd. She rode with them, on the flank, pushing Daisy as hard as the horse could go. She got next to the lead steers, the ones running with their eyes wide and white. She began to whistle. It was not a tune. It was the high, sharp, piercing call she used in the yard. The call for the calves, the call for feed. It was a sound of order in a world of pure, screaming chaos. The led steers, their ears pricked, heard it. In their panic, the familiar sound was an anchor. Their heads turned. Just a fraction. They saw the lantern, a single steady light in the flashing storm. She was turning them. She was bending the entire herd, foot by foot, away from the fatal canyon, pushing them, urging them toward the wide-open river flats. Jonah saw it. He could not believe it. This woman, this barn widow, was pulling his entire life back from the edge of the cliff. He rode hard, adding his own weight, his own shouts, helping her push. Wade Kincaid saw it too. He saw his plan, his final, perfect revenge, being undone by a woman with a lantern. His face contorted with a rage that went beyond reason. He abandoned the herd. He rode down from the ridge, his horse slipping in the mud, his gun drawn. He rode straight for Jonah. Jonah saw him coming. He reined in, his own hand dropping to his holster. The storm and the herd, all of it, focused down to this one man, the rain plastering his hair to his face. Wade raised his pistol. He was taking careful aim, even in the storm. At this range, he would not miss. Eliza saw it. She saw the aim. She saw the intent. She had no gun. She had her horse. She screamed Jonah's name, a raw, wordless sound. She dug her heels into Daisy's sides, turning her, driving her. She slammed the tough little horse's shoulder directly into the flank of Wade Kincaid's stallion. The impact was brutal. Wade's horse staggered, knocking him sideways. His arm was thrown wide. He fired. The gun's report was sharp, deafening. The bullet missed Jonah completely. It streaked past his head, and in the chaos of the storm, it found the only other man-made object on the plain, the windmill. The bullet struck the turning metal blades with a high, screaming clang. It punched a hole clean through the vein. The force, or perhaps the lucky angle of the shot, struck the main water pipe housing. A spray of clean, cold well water exploded from the top of the tower. It rained down, a sudden, shocking shower, mixing with the dirty storm. It hit Jonah, splashing over his face, washing away the mud and the grime. He was so stunned, he could only stare. Wade was thrown off balance, fighting his horse. Jonah did not wait. He launched himself from his saddle, tackling Wade. They both hit the thick, wet mud, and the fight began. It was not a fight. It was a desperate, animal brawl. But Wade was fueled by hate, and Jonah was fueled by Eliza, and by the children, and by the feel of clean water on his face. He landed a solid, final blow to Wade's jaw, and the man went limp. Jesse arrived, his horse limping. The herd was safe, milling and confused on the open flats. He slid from his saddle, his bad leg collapsing under him. He pulled the short, branded rope from his belt. He tied Wade's hands, his knots tight and angry. The storm, as if its purpose was complete, began to soften. The thunder rolled away. The rain gentled. They did not go back to the ranch. They pushed the salvaged herd and the two captured rustlers straight to town. They arrived as the sun was trying to break through the clouds. A muddy, battered, and strangely triumphant procession. The whole town of Cotton Creek saw them come in. They saw Wade Kincaid tied to his saddle. They saw Eliza, her face streaked with soot and mud, her head high. They saw Jonah, bruised and battered, leading the herd. Sheriff Duplass, seeing the crowd, had no choice. He took Wade Kincaid and put him in a cell. Banker Lyle was waiting. He was furious. He stepped into the street. This changes nothing. Hale, the foreclosure hearing is this morning. You are still in default. The town hall was packed. It was not a trial, but a simple foreclosure hearing. The justice of the peace, a stern man named Miller, sat at the front. Banker Lyle presented his case. He spoke of the contract. He spoke of moral turpitude. He held up the affidavits from Reverend Pierce and the saloon men. He pointed to Eliza, who sat in the front row, still in her muddy clothes. "This woman," Lyle said, his voice ringing with false piety, "is a curse. She is a vagrant who has brought nothing but chaos, fire, rustlers, even a stampede. She has devalued this property with her very presence. She is a liability." Jonah stood up, his body rigid with fury. Eliza put her hand on his arm. "No, Jonah." She stood, her small, worn ledger book in her hand. She walked to the front, facing Lyle, facing the town. "Mr. Lyle calls me a liability," she said, her voice clear and carrying. "This is my ledger. In 3 weeks, I have earned $217 for the Hale Ranch, in cash, feed, and services. I am not a liability. I am an asset." Mr. Crenshaw, his hat in his hands, stood up from the back of the room. "He says she is a vagrant. That vagrant rode through a lightning storm to save my prize heifer and my whole season. She is a worker, not a vagrant." The town doctor stood next, his face grim. "Mr. Lyle," he said, "speaks of morality. I was in a room where a child, Timothy Abernathy, was dying. I had given up. This woman, using a river reed, breathed life back into him. That is the only morality that mattered in that moment." Mrs. Abernathy, her face wet with tears, stood up. "She saved my son. She saved my boy. She is a hero." The room, which had been silent, began to buzz. The affidavits in Lyle's hand suddenly looked small, petty, and false. Reverend Pierce, who was standing in the very back, looked at the floor, his face red with shame. Justice Miller banged his gavel. Silence. He looked at Lyle, his expression cold. "Mr. Lyle, your claim of moral turpitude is baseless and, quite frankly, insulting. It is dismissed." He looked at Jonah. "Mr. Hale, your contract stands as written. You will pay your debt after you sell your herd. This hearing is closed." He banged the gavel again. Then he looked at Sheriff Duplass. "As for this other matter, I have a dozen witnesses who just saw Mr. Kincaid brought in, caught in the act. I have a town full of people attesting to your reluctance to investigate. I am hereby opening a formal investigation into your office and your possible collusion with this bank." The room exploded in cheers. Lyle was white-faced. Duplass looked like he was going to be sick. The townspeople surged forward, clapping Jonah on the back, hugging Eliza. Jonah just stood there, in the center of the cheering crowd. It was over. The fight for the ranch, the fight with Wade, the foreclosure. It was all over. The strength that had held him up for months, the adrenaline, the fear, it all left him at once. His knees, bruised from the fight, buckled. He did not faint. He just sank, dropping to one knee on the muddy floor of the town hall. His head bowed, his entire body shaking with a relief so profound it was painful. The crowd went silent, parting. Eliza pushed through. She knelt in front of him, her muddy dress pooling on the floor. She touched his shoulder. "Jonah." He looked up. His face was wet. From the rain, from the windmill water, from the release. He looked at her, at this woman who had been his anchor. He whispered, his voice for her alone, so low she had to lean in. I am not trying to be saved from you anymore." Eliza's own eyes filled with tears. She understood. He was not fighting his feelings. He was not fighting her. He was surrendering. She smiled. She put her scarred hands on his arms and helped him to his feet. The town was watching. The rain had started again, a soft, clean sound drifting through the open doorway. Jonah did not care who saw. He turned to her, his voice clear, strong. Eliza May Carter. He reached into his pocket, his hand fumbling. He did not have a ring. He had nothing. He pulled out a small, simple thong of boot leather he had been cutting earlier. His fingers, rough and clumsy, looped it into a small, crude circle. He held it out to her, his hand shaking, not from fear, but from hope. "Stay," he said, his voice breaking. "Please, just stay. Stay with me. Stay as you have, from the very beginning." Eliza looked at the simple leather loop. It was more beautiful than any diamond. She looked at his bruised, honest, open face. She put her hand out, the one with the wire scars and the burns, and let him slide the leather ring onto her finger. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes." A second later, two small bodies slammed into them. Nate and Nora, who had been brought in by Mrs. Abernathy, burst from the crowd, wrapping their arms around their legs. Jesse Pike, leaning on a borrowed cane, let out a loud, piercing whoop. The whole town cheered. The walk back from the town hall was quiet. The rain had washed the air clean, and the sky was a pale, bruised purple. Jonah Hale walked beside Eliza May Carter, his hand still sticky with mud and his own blood. Finding hers, he did not hold it. He just linked his fingers with hers, a simple, solid connection. Jesse Pike limped behind them, leading the horses. Mrs. Abernathy, who had refused to let the children go, was holding both Nate's and Nora's hands, her steps surprisingly brisk. The townspeople had watched them go, their faces a mixture of awe, respect, and no small amount of shame. The Hale Ranch had fought the bank, the rustlers, and the land, and had won. When they reached the ranch, Jonah stopped at the porch steps. He looked at the house, at the scorched barn, at the windmill turning in the clean evening air. He looked at Eliza, her face still streaked with mud, the leather ring still on her finger. Mrs. Abernathy cleared her throat. She said, "Well, I suppose you two will be wanting a proper wedding." Jonah and Eliza looked at each other. They had not gotten that far. Reverend Pierce arrived the next day, his hat in his hands. He did not ride up with his old, stiff-backed judgment. He walked from the main road, his boots dusty. He found Jonah and Eliza in the yard, sifting through the charred remains of the warehouse. He stood for a long time, just watching them work together, a silent, efficient team. Finally, he spoke. "Mr. Hale, Mistress Carter." They stopped, turning to face him. The Reverend's gaze was fixed on the ground. He said, "I have read the scriptures my entire life. I spoke of moral turpitude. I spoke of appearances." He looked up, and his eyes were full of a terrible, clear shame. "But I was blind. I preached of the Good Samaritan, but I failed to see the one living in my own parish. I failed to see the work." He looked directly at Eliza. "I condemned you, ma'am, while you were saving lives, while you were breathing life back into this ranch and into this town's children. I ask for your forgiveness." Eliza looked at this man, who had been a source of such sharp, public pain. She saw not an enemy, but just a man, flawed and humbled. She nodded. "There is nothing to forgive. Reverend, we were all just trying to see in the dark." He said, "It would be my honor, my deepest honor, if you would allow me to bless your union, here, in this place." The wedding was not a grand affair. It was held 1 week later, in the backyard. The sun was setting, turning the scorched hills a deep, soft gold. Lanterns, borrowed from the general store and from the Crenshaw Ranch, were strung between the porch and the one standing wall of the warehouse. There was no fine china, just tin plates. There was no champagne, just fresh, cold water from the well Eliza had saved. Mrs. Abernathy, her face beaming, had baked 3 heavy pans of cornbread and roasted a side of beef. Jesse Pike, his leg propped up on a stool, sat by the porch and played his fiddle. It was not a somber hymn, but a soft, lively reel. Jonah stood waiting, his face scrubbed clean, his jaw freshly shaved. He wore his only good suit, mended at the elbows. And Eliza came, walking from the house. She wore her best dress, the one she had arrived in, now washed and pressed so many times it was soft as butter. It was patched, but the patches were neat. She wore no bonnet. Her hair, the burned side still short but healing, was brushed back, held in place with a simple ribbon. She wore no gloves. Her scarred hands were bare, and she wore no corset. She moved with a freedom that was new, her every breath deep and easy. Her only adornment was the small, leather ring on her finger. She walked to Jonah, Reverend Pierce, his voice thick, read the simple words. When he blessed them, he spoke of work, of partnership, and of finding a home in the wilderness. Jonah did not kiss her, not in the way of spectacle. He simply took her face in his hands, looked into her eyes, and said, "Welcome home, Eliza." She said, "I am home, Jonah." The celebration was just the quiet hum of a new family. A few days later, they rode to town. It was not a journey of desperation, but of purpose. Jonah, Eliza, and the twins, all four dressed in their Sunday best, walked into the office of Justice Miller. The paperwork was already drawn. Jonah and Eliza, as husband and wife, were filing for the formal adoption of Nate and Nora Hale. They signed the papers. Justice Miller signed as the witness. It was done, the ink drying in the morning light. They were a legal family. As they walked out into the dusty street, Nora, who was holding Eliza's hand, looked up. Her small face was serious. She asked, "Does your name change now? Is it Mistress Hale?" Eliza stopped. She knelt in the dust so she was eye to eye with the little girl. She smiled. She said, "My name is Eliza, sweetheart. That part does not change." She tapped Nora's nose. "My name just gained a home." Jonah heard her. He put his hand on her shoulder, his heart so full he could not speak. He had not taken her name. He had given her his, but she was right. They had, all of them, just gained a home. The first act of that home was to rebuild. The work was hard, but it was not desperate. It was joyful. Jonah and Eliza worked side by side. They did not rebuild the warehouse with pine. They hauled stone from the dry riverbed, building the walls thick and solid. This new building would not burn. Jonah bought a new hand pump for the well, a sturdy cast iron machine. He installed it beside the windmill. He told Eliza, "I will always be grateful for the wind, but I will never be helpless without it again." And the windmill itself, their silent witness. The blade still had the neat, round bullet hole from Wade Kincaid's gun. Jonah climbed the tower, not with anger, but with purpose. He did not replace the blade. He sanded it, and he painted it. He painted all the blades a bright, clear blue, the color of a winter sky. The bullet hole remained, a small, dark circle in the blue, a scar they would not hide. It was a reminder of what they had survived. The great turning heart of the ranch was whole again. The justice that had begun in the town hall continued. Justice Miller's investigation was swift. Sheriff Duplass was removed from his office, his badge taken, his reputation in ruins. The investigation into the bank's practices was even more thorough. Banker Lyle was found to have been colluding with the railroad. Using predatory loans to seize properties he had already promised to sell, he lost his charter. He was gone, his polished office emptied, his reign of paper terror over. The Cotton Creek Bank sat empty for a week. Then a new proprietor arrived. Her name was Martha Flynn. She was a widow from Boston, a woman with her own money and a sharp, no-nonsense mind. She had seen opportunity in the growing railroad town. She bought the bank charter for a fair price. Her first act was to ride out to the Hale Ranch. Eliza met her on the porch. The two women looked at each other. They were a study in contrasts. Martha, in her fine, dark wool suit. Eliza, in her practical, mended dress. But they saw each other. They saw the same steel in each other's eyes. Martha Flynn extended a gloved hand. She said, "Mistress Hale, I have reviewed your husband's loan, and your ledger." She smiled, a small, sharp smile. "I believe we can negotiate a much better rate." Eliza smiled back. She said, "I believe we can, Mistress Flynn." It was the beginning of a long friendship, a quiet circle of women who knew how to build. The ranch itself was changing. Jonah walked out to the corral where Jesse was patiently working with a new, young horse. Jesse's limp was almost gone, his shoulder healed. Jonah leaned on the fence. He said, "The ranch is growing. I am going to need a foreman I can trust with my life." Jesse Pike stopped his work. He turned, a slow smile spreading across his face. He said, "You always had one. Jonah, you just finally decided to say the words." Jonah grinned and held out his hand. They shook. The next week, 2 new hands arrived. Jesse had hired them. One was a quiet, hard-working man from south of the border. The other was a Paiute man from the reservation, who knew the land better than any of them. The talk at the bunkhouse was a mix of Spanish and English. The Hale Ranch paid in coin, not scrip, and the wage was the same for every man who did the work. Eliza, meanwhile, turned her attention to the earth. She took a plow to the land running alongside the irrigation ditch, the one fed by the windmill. The water she had freed, she would now use. She planted corn, squash, and beans. The 3 sisters, their roots and vines helping each other grow. She was putting down roots, real, living ones. The children, seeing her work, wanted to help. They found a wide, flat piece of wood, a plank saved from the fire. With a piece of charcoal, they carefully drew letters. They hammered it, crookedly, onto the new fence post at the front of the ranch. That evening, Jonah saw it. The sign read, in large, uneven letters, "Not for auction." He smiled. He asked Nate what it meant. Nate, his face serious, said, "Mr. Lyle wanted to sell us. He wanted to auction the cows. He cannot. This is our home." Eliza came and stood beside him, her hand sliding into his. She said, "They remembered the word. It is a good sign. It means our family is not for sale." The house was full. That night, at the supper table, for the first time, it felt complete. Jonah, Eliza, Nate, Nora, and Jesse Pike all sat together. The room was loud, full of the clatter of forks and the children's laughter. Jonah was telling a story about the new hand, gesturing with his fork, his voice animated. He was not the silent, grim man who had hidden in the shadows of his barn. He was alive. In his enthusiasm, his arm struck the salt cellar, sending a spray of white crystals across the table. He froze, his old awkwardness returning. He stammered, "Oh, I'm sorry, that was—" Eliza looked at him, her eyes bright with laughter. She reached over and put her hand on his. She said, "Jonah Hale, with a husband as salty as you. I do not think we will need it anyway." There was a second of stunned silence. Then Jesse Pike let out a bark of laughter. Nora giggled, and Nate, seeing everyone else laugh, joined in. Jonah looked at his wife, at her smiling, teasing face, and he felt a lifetime of stiffness break apart. He threw his head back and laughed, a full, free sound that filled his new, warm home. Later, when the children were asleep, Eliza sat on the front porch. The night was cool. The fiddle music from the wedding still seemed to hang in the air. She saw the small, abandoned bird's nest tucked in the rafters, the one where she had hidden her mourning ribbon. She stood on a chair and gently took it down. She sat, the dusty nest in her lap. She took out the thin, black, faded ribbon. It was the last piece of Eliza May Carter. She did not throw it away. She took it to her sewing basket. From a box, she took a tiny brass bell, one that had been meant for a kitten's collar. Her hands, scarred and capable, began to braid the ribbon. She wove it, tightening the faded fabric, making it into something new, something strong. She tied the bell to the end of the braided cord. She went back to the porch and hung it from a small nail on the eave, where the wind would catch it. Jonah came out, putting a shawl over her shoulders. He saw the new, small object. He asked what it was. The wind moved, and the small bell made a tiny, clear, musical sound. Eliza leaned her head against his shoulder. She said, "That is my past. Jonah, it is finally making a clear sound." The new day did not break over Cotton Creek. It seeped in, A slow, clear infusion of light that smelled of sweetgrass and damp earth. The wind, for once, was not an enemy. It was a soft breath that carried the scent of Eliza, her garden, the one planted by the irrigation ditch. It stirred the tiny bell she had hung on the porch, the one made from her old mourning ribbon. The sound was high, clean, and impossible to monitor. Nate and Nora ran laughing in the yard, their small legs strong, their faces round and healthy. They were chasing a yellow butterfly, their shouts a bright new sound that the ranch had never heard. They were not the silent, hollow-eyed children who had crept into a barn for comfort. They were just children. Above them, the windmill turned. Its great blue-painted blades moved in their steady, powerful circle. The single dark bullet hole a small, unhidden scar. The Wyoming sky was vast, and the land was still hard. But inside the fences of the Hale Ranch, there was warmth. Eliza sat at the kitchen table, the ledger book open. It was full of neat, black ink. The loan to the bank, the one held by Martha Flynn, was almost paid. Her veterinary service was a real, documented success. She closed the ledger and opened a different book, her own small, personal journal. She dipped the pen in the ink. She wrote, not to anyone, but to the world. Today I'm no longer the barn widow. I am Eliza Hale. This house calls me mother. She looked out the window at the children. She thought of the long, cold nights she had held them as they shivered from fever. She thought of the panic of the snake bite, the terror of the fire. She thought of Jonah, his clumsy, heartfelt proposal. Love, she thought, was not a lightning strike. It was not a single, grand moment. It was an action, repeated until it became a foundation. It was the act of holding a sick child. It was teaching a small hand to tie a lariat knot. It was riding into a storm to save a calf. It was, she thought, the simple, profound act of blocking the wind for someone else. A mother was not just the person who gave you life. A mother was the person who stayed. That evening, the house was quiet. Jessie had gone to town for a Saturday night dance. The children were asleep, finally worn out from their day of chasing butterflies. Jonah and Eliza sat on the rug in the parlor, the place where their new life had truly begun. The fire was lit, casting a warm, low light. The bearskin rug was soft beneath them. They were drinking coffee, their shoulders just touching. Jonah looked into the fire, a slow, comfortable smile playing on his lips. He was a different man. The old, haunted tightness around his eyes was gone. He looked at his wife, her profile soft in the firelight, her short, scarred hair growing back in soft waves. He said, his voice low and teasing, "I was thinking, if you ever decide to throw me on the floor again, in this room." Eliza turned, her eyes bright with laughter. She asked, "Yes." He grinned. "Maybe," he said. "Just remember to move the pillows first. My back is not what it used to be." Eliza laughed, a full, free sound that filled the room. She leaned her head against his shoulder. "You just keep right on being helpless. Jonah Hale." She kissed his cheek. "I have no plans to save you." He turned, and his smile faded into something deeper, something warm and certain. He kissed her. It was not a kiss of frantic need or of new, awkward discovery. It was a kiss of arrival. It was slow and warm, and it tasted of coffee and trust. It was the kiss of two people who were, finally, completely, home. The next week, the letter arrived. It came with the new mail carrier, a route just established by the railroad, which was opening a full post office and telegraph station in Cotton Creek. The world was shrinking. The town was growing. The letter was for Eliza. It was from Martha Flynn, the banker. Martha wrote that she had been speaking with some partners in Cheyenne. The railroad needed reliable services for the cattle it was shipping. There was a rumor of a government contract for beef. She said that a formal, licensed veterinary service, one that could certify cattle as healthy for shipping, would be an invaluable asset. She wrote, taken the liberty of filing the preliminary paperwork in the name of Mistress Eliza Hale, proprietor. Jonah read the letter over her shoulder. He felt a swell of pride so powerful it almost took his breath away. The town, the entire territory, was seeing his wife for what she was. Not a widow, not a hand, a professional, a founder. That night, the house was still. The day had been long, full of plans. Jonah walked down the hallway, checking the doors. He looked into the parlor. Eliza was asleep in the big armchair, the one that had belonged to his father. The fire had burned down to low, red embers. Nate was curled in her lap, his head tucked under her chin. Nora was asleep at her feet, her small hand resting on Eliza, her knee. Jonah stopped in the doorway. He looked at the scene. The woman, the children, wrapped in sleep, held together in the warm, safe center of his home. He saw the charcoal drawing on the mantelpiece above them, the crude stick figures, the spinning windmill. It was the same image he had seen that first night in the cold, dark barn. The same image he had seen in the parlor, streaked with ash and soot. But this time, there was no fear. There was no desperation. There was no grief. He walked quietly into the room. He unfolded a thick wool blanket and gently, so gently, draped it over all three of them. He tucked it around Nora, her shoulders, his large, scarred hand brushing her hair. He touched Eliza, her cheek. He stood there, watching them breathe, for a long time. He was not a broken ex-soldier, or a failed rancher, or a man terrified of loss. He was a husband. He was a father. His heart, which he had guarded for so long, felt full to bursting. He turned, and quietly, he put out the lamp. The first light of morning always struck the fence post by the road first. It lit up the small, crude, hand-painted sign. It caught the uneven, triumphant letters. Not for auction. It was a sign for the world, in this new, hard land, a place where men sold their honor, their loyalty, their futures, where everything had a price. The Hale Ranch had found the one thing that could not be bought, the one thing that was not for sale. Justice, Jonah knew, was not just a gavel falling in a crowded room. It was the sound of Jesse Pike laughing in the bunkhouse with the new hands. It was the look of respect on Martha Flynn, her face. It was the quiet, daily act of treating people right. And hope, Eliza knew, was not a single, blinding flash of light, like the fire they had survived. It was not a firework. It was the stubborn, quiet persistence of the windmill blades, turning and turning and turning, even in the driest wind, pulling life up from the deep, dark earth. The people who left Cotton Creek took with them stories of hardship, of dust, of failed silver mines. But those who stayed, those who saw the Hale Ranch rebuild, they carried a different feeling. They carried the warmth of a home that had been torn apart and then stitched back together, not with thread, but with sweat and laughter and a hard-won, stubborn respect. On the dry land of Cotton Creek, on the ashes of a burned warehouse and a broken past, Jonah and Eliza Hale had planted something. It was a root so deep and strong that no banker, no rustler, and no drought could ever foreclose on it. They had planted, finally, the simple, powerful seed of belonging. Thank you for listening to our story. We would love to know where you are listening from, so please leave a comment below so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And please subscribe to my channel Wild West Tales, like the video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story in the video can be heard by more people.